I remember the first time I realized something was terribly wrong. It was a humid summer night in rural Ohio, the kind of night where the cicadas drone relentlessly and the air hangs heavy with the smell of wet earth and fertilizer. I had just returned from visiting my brother in Columbus, taking the back roads to avoid traffic. I was used to these roads, every turn, every curve, every broken fence post. But that night, everything seemed different. The road was darker than usual, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. I was about 20 miles from my house when I saw it, a figure standing at the side of the road. At first, I thought it was a hitchhiker, but there was something wrong about the way it stood. Motionless, stiff, too still. My headlights cut across it, and I could make out a dark hood pulled low, hiding the face. I slowed instinctively, but before I could decide what to do, it lifted one arm, pointing, not waving, pointing directly at my car. My stomach dropped. I floored the accelerator and passed it, glancing briefly in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw it moving, slipping along the tree line faster than it could possibly run. By the time I got home, my hands were trembling. My apartment was small and old, a converted farmhouse on the edge of a forgotten town, the kind of place with peeling paint, creaking floors, and a history no one talks about. I locked the door behind me and tried to shake off the unease. The first night passed in restless sleep, but at 2:17 a.m., I woke to a sound that froze me, whispering. Not faint, not the sound of the wind. It was deliberate, a low, insistent murmur coming from the living room. I strained to hear words, but all I could make out were syllables that sounded vaguely like my name. The next few nights were worse. The whispering grew louder. I began to hear footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate, pacing just outside my bedroom door. I would lie in bed, heart pounding, unable to move, listening as the steps circled my apartment. Sometimes I would see shadows flicker across the wall, shadows that moved independently of the light. I began to notice things, chairs slightly out of place, keys missing and then reappearing on the counter, doors that I remembered locking open in the middle of the night. I told myself it was stress, lack of sleep, maybe even a rat. But then I saw it. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, standing at the end of the hallway. Its limbs were bent at unnatural angles, and its face, if it had a face, was featureless, pale, and smooth like marble. I froze. I couldn't breathe. It tilted its head toward me and stepped back into the shadows. I started documenting everything. Cameras, audio recorders, notes. Every time I reviewed the footage, something was off. Shadows appeared in impossible angles, figures blurred and distorted, audio caught whispers and voices that sounded like mine and not mine at the same time. I started losing track of days. Nights became unbearable. Sleep became a stranger. I called the police once when a chair flew across the room. They found nothing, of course. I knew it was real. I could feel it. It wasn't just the shadows, the whispers, the movement. It was a presence, patient and deliberate, feeding on my fear. Weeks later, I met an older neighbor, a man named Harold. I asked him casually if anything strange had ever happened in the building. He paused, then whispered, "You don't want to see it. You don't want to hear it. Be careful who you let inside." I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off, but the concern in his eyes made my stomach twist. That night, there was a knock on my door. 3 slow raps. I didn't answer. The whispering started immediately after, coming from inside the apartment this time, circling me like a predator. I could hear words now. "Come here. Look. Now." I stayed in my bedroom, bathed in the dim glow of my phone flashlight, shaking and silent. I tried leaving, packed my car and drove to my sister's house 2 states over. I thought I had escaped, but that night I found a note slipped under the motel door. "You can't hide." My blood ran cold. There was no one around, no explanation. The police found nothing. I realized it wasn't bound to a place. It was following me. The shadows, the whispers, the presence. Sleep became impossible. I barely ate. I stopped going out. Friends stopped calling. I stopped answering the phone. Everywhere I went, I could feel it. Watching, waiting, patient. I called a paranormal investigator. He arrived with EMF meters, cameras, a crucifix. He spent hours documenting the apartment, recording temperature drops, spikes in electromagnetic fields, shadows appearing on infrared cameras. He told me bluntly, "It's attached to you, not the apartment. Distance won't save you. It's patient. It waits, and it doesn't forget." From that moment on, my life became a waking nightmare. I could feel it in every shadow, hear it in every whisper. Objects moved on their own, chairs sliding across rooms, doors opening and closing, my keys disappearing and reappearing in places I hadn't touched. Sometimes I would see it standing at the end of the hallway, taller than the ceiling, limbs contorted, face smooth and featureless. Other times I would wake to find it crouched outside my window, staring in with hollow eyes. Months passed. I became a recluse. I stopped working. My friends disappeared from my life, either scared off or convinced I had lost my mind. Sleep was a distant memory. I started seeing it even when my eyes were closed. Shapes at the edges of my vision, shadows twisting impossibly. The whispers became voices, telling me things only I could know, recounting memories from my childhood, secrets I had never told anyone. One night, I woke to the cold pressure of a hand on my shoulder. I bolted upright, but there was nothing there. Then the whispers, louder than ever, repeating my name. I could feel its gaze on me, heavy, oppressive, suffocating. The air itself seemed to vibrate with its presence. I realized I couldn't run, couldn't hide. It was patient. It was inevitable. I tried everything, rituals, prayers, moving to another city, but nothing worked. It followed me everywhere, growing stronger with each night, each moment of fear. My apartment became a cage. My car became a cage. Even being outside wasn't safe. Shadows twisted unnaturally. Figures appeared in empty streets. Whispers spoke my name, recounted my life, promised to spare. I began documenting it in detail, hoping anyone might believe me. Cameras, audio, notes. I even contacted a local historian, hoping to understand the building's past. It had been built in the late 1970s on the site of a burned-down farmhouse. Several deaths had occurred over the years, unexplained, some tenants simply disappearing. Stories of shadows, figures at windows, whispers in the dead of night. The entity, I realized, was older than I could comprehend. Patient, calculating, persistent. Months turned into a year. I was isolated, exhausted, terrified. Shadows moved at the corners of my eyes, whispers invaded my thoughts, objects defied reality. One night I awoke fully to see it, at the foot of my bed, impossibly tall, limbs bent like broken branches, its face featureless, pressed into my mind. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. I could only feel the weight of it, suffocating, omnipresent. And then in a voice that was not spoken but felt, it whispered, "You are mine." I blacked out. When I awoke, I was outside my apartment, neighbors watching me, concerned. The police found no evidence of anyone entering my apartment. I tried to leave, moved across the country, thinking distance might matter. It didn't. Sleep remains impossible. Shadows twist unnaturally. Whispers fill every silence. I have lost everything: friends, work, health, sanity. And I know with certainty that it is patient, waiting, and inevitable. If you ever feel a presence behind you when you're alone, if shadows move in impossible ways, if whispers call your name, do not answer, do not look back. Once it marks you, it will not let go. Distance does not matter. Sleep will never return, and one day it will reach you fully, and there will be no escape. Story the end. The first time I saw the house, it didn't seem strange. I'd been desperate to find a place after my roommate bailed on me in the middle of my lease, taking half the furniture and most of the rent money with her. The ad was on Craigslist. 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood, a little outside of Dayton, Ohio. It looked normal in the photos. White siding, blue shutters, a neat little porch, and a backyard that backed up to a line of woods. The rent was low, lower than anything else I'd seen, and I was out of options. The landlord, a guy named Richard, met me out front when I came to see it. He was tall, maybe late 50s, with thinning gray hair and a handshake that lingered too long. He didn't bother with a sales pitch. He just unlocked the front door and stepped aside, letting me wander through the empty house while he leaned against the porch railing, smoking a cigarette and scrolling through his phone. It smelled like dust inside. The floors creaked, but the walls were freshly painted. There were 3 bedrooms upstairs, one smaller room downstairs, and a narrow hallway that led to the basement. The basement door was shut, but I could hear the faint hum of a dehumidifier down there. "You won't want to spend much time in the basement," Richard said when I came back upstairs. "It's dry, but it's old. People don't like old basements." I didn't think much of it. I signed the lease that afternoon. Moving in was easy. I didn't have much, just a bed, some clothes, my TV, and a couple of boxes of books. For the first week, the house felt fine, quiet. I worked long shifts at the hospital, so most nights I'd collapse into bed, exhausted, barely aware of my surroundings. It started small. The first night I noticed it, I woke up around 3 a.m. I couldn't say why. No sound, no nightmare. I just opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling. Then I heard the soft thud of footsteps upstairs, slow, even, like someone walking from one end of the hallway to the other. I froze, listening. The house was old. It creaked when the wind blew, and the floorboards groaned when I walked across them. But these weren't random pops and shifts. These were footsteps. I sat up, heart pounding, and held my breath. They stopped. I told myself it was nothing, an old house settling, maybe a raccoon on the roof. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I checked the upstairs hallway. Nothing. The windows were locked. Everything was where I left it. 2 nights later, I heard it again, this time louder, heavier, like someone pacing. I gripped the baseball bat I kept by my bed and crept upstairs. The hallway was empty. The rooms were empty. Even the air felt still, heavy, like it hadn't been disturbed in hours. I started locking my bedroom door after that. By the end of the second week, it wasn't just footsteps. I'd come home from work and find small things out of place. A chair pulled slightly away from the table, the bathroom door ajar when I was sure I'd closed it, a glass sitting in the sink that I didn't remember using. Once I found my keys in the middle of the kitchen counter when I swore I'd left them on the hook by the door. I started keeping the lights on at night. One evening, I was sitting on the couch, eating takeout and watching TV, when I heard the front door creak open. It was slow, drawn out, like someone easing it open to avoid making noise. I froze, the fork halfway to my mouth, and stared at the doorway to the hall. "Hello?" My voice cracked when I said it. Nothing. I grabbed the bat again and inched toward the door. The front door was wide open, swinging slightly on its hinges. The night air was cool, but there was no breeze strong enough to push it open like that. I stepped out onto the porch, my bare feet stinging on the rough wood, and looked around. The driveway was empty. The street was quiet. When I turned back toward the house, I swear I saw the edge of a shadow slipping out of view at the top of the stairs. I didn't sleep at all that night. I called Richard the next day and told him the front door wasn't latching right. He said he'd send someone to look at it, but no one ever came. When I followed up, his number went straight to voicemail. By the third week, the noises escalated. The footsteps became a nightly ritual, always around 3 in the morning. Sometimes they'd stop right outside my bedroom door, like someone standing there, listening. The knob never turned, but I could hear faint breathing, shallow and irregular, just beyond the wood. Once, I woke up to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open, even though I'd locked it. The lock was still engaged when I checked, but the door was standing open, and the hallway beyond it was pitch black. I started sleeping in my car some nights, parked in the driveway with the engine off and the keys clutched in my hand. The neighbors weren't much help. The guy next door, an older man named Tom, avoided eye contact whenever I waved. The woman across the street just shook her head when I asked if anything strange ever happened around here. "That house," she muttered, her voice low. "People don't stay long." I asked her what she meant, but she just closed her door. The breaking point came in the middle of my fourth week. I got home late, around midnight. The house was dark and still. I'd left the kitchen light on when I left for work, but it was off when I walked in. My stomach sank. I knew I'd left it on. I stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind me, and froze. There was a faint hum coming from the basement. The dehumidifier, I thought at first, but then I heard it, whispering. Soft, almost too soft to hear, like several voices speaking at once. I don't know why I opened the basement door. Curiosity, maybe, or some stupid hope that I'd find a rational explanation. The steps creaked under my weight as I descended, the air growing colder and damper with each step. When I reached the bottom, the whispering stopped. The basement was empty, just bare concrete walls and the humming dehumidifier in the corner. But the far wall, the one partially hidden by a stack of old paint cans, looked wrong. There was a hairline crack running from floor to ceiling, and when I pressed my ear to it, I could hear faint scratching from the other side. I ran back upstairs, slammed the door shut, and shoved a chair under the knob. That night, I dreamed of someone standing in the corner of my room, watching me. When I woke up, The chair I'd wedged under the doorknob was on the other side of the room. I don't remember packing. I just remember throwing my clothes into a bag, grabbing my keys, and driving. I didn't stop until I was 2 states away, sleeping in a rest stop parking lot with the doors locked. When I finally called Richard to tell him I was breaking the lease, the number was disconnected. I went back one last time during the day to grab the rest of my things. The house was silent, sunlight spilling across the hardwood floors like nothing had ever happened. I went upstairs, grabbed my boxes, and on the way down, I glanced toward the basement door. It was open. I swear I hadn't touched it. I didn't look inside. I just ran to my car, slammed the door, and drove away. 2 weeks later, I saw the listing online again. Same photos, same rent, no mention of me ever living there. And sometimes late at night when I'm lying in bed in my new apartment, I swear I hear it. Soft, deliberate footsteps pacing somewhere just beyond the walls. Story the end. The first time I noticed something was wrong was on a Thursday night, late summer, when the air still carried that heavy warmth that sticks to your skin long after the sun goes down. I was driving home from work, windows cracked, music low, trying to shake off the stress of another double shift. The road that led to my house cuts through miles of nothing. Fields on both sides, the occasional streetlight that flickers like it's on its last breath. It's quiet out there, too quiet most nights. About 2 miles from my driveway, I saw someone standing on the shoulder of the road, just standing there. At first, I thought it was a kid, maybe a teenager, wearing a light-colored hoodie. Their face was turned down, and they didn't look up as I passed. No car nearby, no bike, nothing to explain why they were there in the dark on that isolated road. I slowed down for a second, hand hovering over my horn, thinking maybe they needed help. But something in me told me not to. Something about the stillness of the figure, the way they didn't shift their weight, didn't fidget, didn't even seem to breathe, froze me in place. I drove past without stopping, telling myself I'd imagined it, that maybe it was just some local kid waiting for a ride. But when I checked my rearview mirror, they were gone. I pulled into my driveway 10 minutes later, headlights sweeping across the front of my little house. I have one of those wraparound porches and a big oak tree in the yard that creaks when the wind hits it just right. It looked like any other night, quiet, dark, safe. Still, I double-checked the locks before heading to bed. The next morning, I mentioned it to my neighbor, Jerry, while we both stood at our mailboxes. He's in his 60s, retired, knows everyone and everything in our neighborhood. When I told him about the person on the side of the road, his face got tight, like I'd said something I shouldn't have. "Out on County Road 12?" he asked, voice low. "Yeah, right before the turnoff. You know anyone who hangs around there?" Jerry hesitated before shaking his head. "Don't pick up anybody out there. If you see him again, you just keep driving. You hear me?" I laughed it off, thinking he was just being dramatic, but the way he stared at me, unblinking, dead serious, stuck with me all day. That night, I worked another late shift. Didn't get off until almost midnight. The drive home was the same dark stretch of road, the same still fields, the same hum of tires against asphalt, and in the same spot as the night before, the figure was there again. This time, they were closer to the edge of the road, heads still lowered, hands hanging stiffly at their sides. My stomach knotted. I slowed again, curiosity winning over fear for just a second, but when I did, they lifted their head. I can't explain exactly what I saw, but I knew instantly that it wasn't right. The face didn't match the body. It was wrong somehow. Pale, stretched, like wax melting under a flame. The eyes were too dark, too deep, like pits that went on forever. I hit the gas and didn't look back. When I got home, I parked under the streetlight instead of pulling into my garage. I sat there for a few minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles ached, trying to convince myself I hadn't seen what I thought I saw. Eventually, I forced myself inside, locked every door and window, and left the lights on until morning. Over the next week, I saw the figure 3 more times, always in the same spot, always waiting. Each time they stood a little closer to the road, a little closer to me. By the 4th night, I started taking the long way home, adding an extra 20 minutes to my drive just to avoid that stretch of road. It worked for a while, until it didn't. It was a rainy Tuesday when it followed me home. The rain came down hard that night, the kind that blurs your vision and turns the world into a smear of headlights and shadows. I was almost home, turning onto my street, when I caught sight of something in my side mirror. A shape, dark and soaked, standing under the street light at the far end of the cul-de-sac. I blinked, telling myself it was a trick of the rain, but when I turned into my driveway, I saw it clearly through the curtain of water. The same figure, standing perfectly still, watching. I didn't get out of the car right away. I sat there, engine running, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. After a few minutes, I forced myself out, keys clutched tight in my fist, and ran to the front door. Once inside, I locked the door and pulled the curtain back just enough to peek outside. The streetlight flickered, rain coming down in sheets, but the spot where the figure had been standing was empty. I didn't sleep that night. Over the next few days, little things started happening around the house. At first, it was small stuff. My back door, which I always keep locked, would be found slightly ajar in the morning. The motion sensor light in the backyard would click on at random times, even when nothing was there. My dog, Max, started barking at corners of the house, low growls rumbling in his throat like he could see something I couldn't. One night, around 2 a.m, I woke up to the sound of footsteps on my porch. Slow, deliberate, heavy enough to make the wood creak. I froze in bed, listening, every muscle in my body tense. The footsteps stopped right outside my bedroom window. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, in the stillness, I heard it, a low, scraping sound like nails dragging across the siding of my house. I called the police the next morning, but when they came out, there was nothing to find. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing. One of the officers, a younger guy, gave me a sympathetic look and said it was probably just an animal. But animals don't knock on windows. By the second week, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I started staying at a friend's house, too afraid to be alone. She thought I was overreacting until the night I woke up to find her front door wide open, the security chain dangling like it had been ripped loose. That's when I knew whatever this thing was, it wasn't just tied to my house. It was tied to me. I tried everything, changing my routine, leaving lights on, even sprinkling salt along the thresholds like Jerry told me to. Nothing worked. Every night I'd catch glimpses of it, standing at the edge of the yard, watching from across the street, its face still wrong, still shifting like it was trying to become something familiar and failing every time. One night, desperate and exhausted, I went to Jerry. I didn't care how crazy I sounded. He didn't laugh. Instead, he closed the door, locked it, and told me to sit down. "You've seen it," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, throat tight. "Then you need to leave, tonight. Don't pack, don't wait. Just go and don't come back." I wanted to ask him what it was, why it was here, why it had chosen me. But the way his eyes darted toward the window, the way his voice dropped to a whisper like even speaking too loud might draw its attention, shut me up. I didn't listen. I told myself I couldn't just leave everything behind, that it would stop if I ignored it long enough. The last night I spent in that house, I woke to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. The air in the room was cold, so cold I could see my breath in the dark. I didn't move, didn't even blink. And then I heard it. Breathing. Slow, deep, steady breathing coming from the corner of the room. I fumbled for my phone, the faint glow of the screen barely cutting through the darkness, and in that pale light I saw it, standing there, closer than it had ever been. Its face was inches from mine now, the hollow pits where eyes should have been locked on me. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. The last thing I remember is the sound of my dog barking, a sharp, panicked sound that cut through the air before everything went black. When I woke up, it was morning. The front door was wide open. Max was gone. I haven't seen him since. I left that day, packed a single bag, and drove until I ran out of gas 2 states away. It's been 3 months now. I've changed my number, quit my job, and moved to a city where the streets are never quiet, where there's always someone around. But sometimes, late at night, I catch it in the corner of my eye. A reflection in a shop window, a figure across the street, always standing, always watching. And every night, without fail, just as I'm about to drift off to sleep, I hear it, that slow, steady breathing, waiting. Story, the end. It started with the smell. Not the kind of smell you can easily describe, Not just rot or mildew, but something heavy and metallic, sharp enough to stick to the back of your throat. The first time I noticed it, I was alone in my apartment, sitting on the second-hand couch my sister had given me after she moved out of state. It was a warm night in July, the kind where the humidity presses in through the cracks of old window frames, clinging to your skin. I thought maybe it was the pipes or the trash chute in the hallway. The building wasn't exactly new. Most of the tenants were either broke college kids or people too stubborn to move, even though the place had been falling apart for years. But then the smell got stronger. I got up, checking my tiny kitchen, then the bathroom, running the tap to see if it was something in the drain. Nothing. I even went out into the hallway, but the air there was clear, just the faint smell of bleach from the janitor's last half-assed mop job. When I came back inside, the smell was so thick it made my eyes water, but just as quickly as it had come, it was gone. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a dead mouse in the walls, something the landlord would eventually deal with, or maybe my mind playing tricks after a long day. I worked nights at a gas station off Route 9, barely sleeping during the day, running on energy drinks and stale coffee. Hallucinations wouldn't have been a stretch. That night, though, something else happened. I was lying in bed trying to force myself to sleep before my shift when I heard it, a dragging sound. Slow, deliberate, like something heavy being pulled across the floor above me. My upstairs neighbor, an older guy named Carl, was quiet to the point where I sometimes forgot he was even there. He worked construction, left early, came back late, and minded his own business. I tried to ignore it, rolling onto my side, but the sound didn't stop. Drag, pause, drag. It went on for almost an hour before finally going silent. The next morning, I ran into Mrs. Green, the building manager, when I was heading out for coffee. She was this hunched, bird-like woman who'd been living there since the 70s, with hair that looked like steel wool and eyes that never seemed to blink enough. "Morning," I muttered, half asleep. She didn't answer, just stared at me like she was looking through me, then muttered something under her breath I couldn't make out and shuffled past me, her shoes scraping against the cracked linoleum. I brushed it off, just another weird interaction in a building full of weird interactions. But things didn't stop. The smell came back every night after that, always stronger when I was alone. It clung to the corners of my apartment, soaking into the walls, and no amount of scrubbing or open windows could make it go away. The dragging noise upstairs became a nightly occurrence too, sometimes stopping for hours, sometimes going on until dawn. One night, I worked a double shift and got home around 4 a.m. The building was silent, the kind of deep silence that makes your ears ring. I walked past Carl's door on my way up the stairs, noticing it was cracked open an inch. I hesitated. Something about it felt wrong. There was no light coming from inside, no sound, just that smell. Thick and cloying, like copper and rot, and something sweet underneath it. I almost knocked, but something told me not to. My hand hovered over the doorframe for a second before I pulled it back and kept walking, telling myself I was imagining things. The next morning, when I woke up, the hallway was filled with cops. 2 cruisers were parked outside, lights flashing silently against the cracked windows. Mrs. Green stood in the doorway, wringing her hands as uniformed officers carried black bags down the stairs. "Carl's dead," one of the tenants whispered when I stepped out. They said they found him in his apartment, but they wouldn't say how. No one saw anything. No one heard anything. Just dead. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the ceiling where his apartment used to be, listening to the hum of the old radiator. The smell didn't come, and neither did the dragging, but the silence was worse. It pressed down on me, thick and suffocating, until every creak of the floorboards made me jump. A week passed. The cops came and went, the building returned to its usual rhythm, but something in my apartment had shifted. At first, it was small things. My keys weren't where I left them. The bathroom light would be on when I knew I'd turned it off. My phone would be dead in the morning, even though I'd charged it overnight. Then came the footsteps. Not the dragging anymore, just footsteps, soft and deliberate, pacing the length of my apartment when I was in bed. I'd hear them start in the living room, move slowly toward the kitchen, pause by the bathroom, then stop outside my bedroom door. I never opened the door. I couldn't. One night, the footsteps stopped, and instead, there was breathing. Slow, heavy breathing, right outside the thin wood of my bedroom door. I lay there frozen, barely daring to breathe myself until the sound faded and the apartment was silent again. I thought about breaking my lease, packing up and leaving, but moving takes money I didn't have. And a part of me kept telling myself I was imagining it, that the stress and the lack of sleep were getting to me. Then I found the note. It was on my kitchen counter when I got home from work, a piece of paper folded neatly in half. There was no handwriting on the outside, but when I opened it, there were 3 words scrawled across the page in jagged, uneven letters. It's not over. I locked every door and window, sat with my back against the wall, and waited for morning. The next night, the smell came back, stronger than ever, choking the air, filling every corner of the apartment. My chest tightened, my throat burned, and just as I stumbled toward the window, desperate for air, the power went out. I stood there in the pitch-black darkness, the only sound, the pounding of my heart in my ears, and then, slow, deliberate, came the footsteps. This time, they weren't outside my door. They were in my room. Story the end. I grew up in a small town in northern Indiana, the kind of place where the loudest thing at night was the occasional bark of a dog or the faint hum of a train somewhere far off. Life there was quiet, predictable, and safe, or at least it felt that way. By the time I was 25, I'd moved out of my parents' house and into a small one-bedroom apartment on the far end of town, near the railroad tracks. It wasn't much, just a second-floor unit above an old laundromat, but it was cheap, and I liked the solitude. I worked as an overnight clerk at a gas station off the interstate, so I slept during the day and lived my nights in a haze of fluorescent lights and coffee. The first strange thing happened about 2 months after I moved in. It was around 3 in the morning, and I was walking home from work. The streets were empty, the kind of empty where you can hear your own footsteps echo. I was almost to my building when I noticed someone standing at the edge of the parking lot. At first, I thought it was just a random guy waiting for someone, but as I got closer, I saw that he wasn't moving. He was just standing there, facing my building. I couldn't make out his face because of the shadows, but I remember the way he was dressed, a plain black hoodie and jeans, hands shoved into his pockets. I told myself it was nothing. People hung around there sometimes, waiting for friends or just loitering. But when I went up the narrow staircase to my place, I couldn't shake the feeling that his head turned to follow me as I climbed the stairs. I locked my door that night and double-checked the window latch, even though I felt silly doing it. A week later, it happened again. Same time, same spot. This time, though, when I noticed him, he slowly turned his head toward me, and even though it was dark, I swear I felt his eyes lock on mine. He didn't move, didn't say a word, just watched me walk into my building and disappear inside. I told myself not to panic, that it was probably just someone passing through. But that night, I barely slept. Over the next couple of weeks, I started noticing little things. My front door would be unlocked when I knew I'd locked it. The window in my bedroom, just a small sliding thing above the radiator, would sometimes be cracked open in the morning. I convinced myself it was just me being tired from the night shifts, forgetting things, but deep down I knew something was wrong. I started keeping a baseball bat next to my bed. I even thought about buying a security camera, but money was tight and I figured I was just being paranoid. Then, one night after work, I came home to find the light in my living room on. I always turned it off before leaving. Always. My stomach sank, but I tried to stay calm as I stepped inside. Everything looked normal. The couch, the coffee table, the small TV sitting on the stand. Nothing seemed out of place, but the air felt wrong, like someone had been there. I grabbed the bat and went room to room, checking the kitchen, the bathroom, the closet. Nothing. I locked the door, sat down on the couch, and tried to tell myself I was imagining things. But when I glanced over at the window, I froze. There on the glass was a single fingerprint smudge, not mine, smudged low, like someone had leaned in, peering inside. The next night at work, I told my coworker Dan about it. He laughed it off, said it was probably some junkie looking for a place to crash. "If you're that freaked out," he said, "call the cops or get a dog." I didn't do either. Something about calling the cops felt pointless. I didn't even have proof anything had happened. And a dog? I could barely afford rent. By the third week, the noises started. Soft creaks in the hallway outside my door, the faint scrape of something against the stairwell railing. One night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard what sounded like my doorknob turning, slow and deliberate. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest, staring at the faint line of light under the door. Nothing happened for what felt like an eternity. And then, silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. I started leaving the lights on when I left for work, thinking maybe it would make whoever it was back off. It didn't. One morning, after a long shift, I came home to find a scrap of paper taped to my door. No writing, just a crude drawing of an eye in black marker. That was the first time I seriously considered breaking my lease and getting out of there, but again, I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was some kid playing a prank. That's what I kept repeating to myself, like if I said it enough, it would become true. A few nights later, around 2 in the morning, I was in the middle of my shift when Dan asked me to take the trash out back. I stepped outside, the alley quiet except for the hum of the highway in the distance. That's when I saw him again, the man in the black hoodie, standing at the edge of the lot, just far enough away that I couldn't see his face. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. My skin crawled. I went back inside, locked the door, and told Dan I wasn't going back out there until the sun came up. He laughed, but I could tell from the look in his eyes that he was starting to believe me. The next night was when things escalated. I got home a little after 3, dead tired and just wanting to collapse in bed. I unlocked my door, stepped inside, and froze. My couch had been moved. Just slightly, but enough for me to notice. The coffee table was pushed a few inches to the left, and the baseball bat I always kept by the bed was leaning against the kitchen counter. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial 911. The dispatcher was calm, said they'd send someone over. 2 officers showed up 20 minutes later, looked around, and told me there was no sign of forced entry. They suggested I might have moved the furniture myself and forgotten, maybe while sleepwalking. I knew that wasn't true. I started crashing at Dan's place after that. His apartment was closer to the station, and I felt safer with someone else around. But even there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I walked home to grab clothes or check the mail, I saw him, always in the same spot, always just far enough away that I couldn't make out his face. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. It was my night off, and I decided to stay in, thinking maybe I'd finally get some sleep. Around midnight, I woke up to a noise, soft, almost like a footstep. My room was dark, but the streetlight outside threw just enough glow through the blinds for me to see the silhouette. A figure, standing in the corner, motionless. My breath caught in my throat, and before I could even move, the figure tilted its head, slow and unnatural, like it was studying me. I scrambled for the bat, but by the time I flicked on the light, the room was empty. The window, though, was open. That was the last night I ever stayed in that apartment. I packed up my things the next morning and left half of it behind, not caring what it cost me to break the lease. I moved 2 towns over, closer to my parents, thinking I could outrun whatever was happening. For a while, it worked. I started sleeping again. I stopped looking over my shoulder everywhere I went. But a few weeks ago, I came home from work and found a scrap of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. No words, just that same crude drawing of an eye. Now, every night I feel it again. That same prickling on the back of my neck, that sense of being watched. I don't know who he is or what he wants, but I know this isn't over. And the worst part is, deep down, I think I know how this ends. Story the end. It was a late October evening when I first noticed something strange about the stretch of road that led to my new apartment in the outskirts of Springfield, Missouri. I had moved there for work, taking a temporary assignment at a local logistics company that required me to stay near their warehouse on the edge of town. The drive from the highway was long and winding, lined with dense woods on either side, and by the time I reached my building, darkness had already swallowed the area completely. The road itself wasn't well lit, just a few flickering lamps that barely cast light over the cracked asphalt, and it gave me an uneasy feeling that I couldn't shake, no matter how much I tried to rationalize it. I chalked it up to nerves from moving to a new place and the isolation of being miles away from familiar faces. The apartment complex looked almost deserted when I pulled up. It was an old brick building, 3 stories tall with peeling paint and rusty railings. The kind of place that seemed cheap but not dangerous, or at least I hoped it wasn't. The leasing office was closed when I arrived, but the manager had left me the keys in a lockbox. The smell hit me first, damp, moldy, with a hint of something metallic, almost like blood. I thought it was just the building being old, so I ignored it and started moving my things inside. The first night was the hardest. I had barely unpacked before I fell into bed, exhausted from the drive. I woke sometime in the middle of the night to the faint sound of scratching, like nails dragging across wood. My first thought was rats. The building was old enough to have them. But the sound didn't come from the walls. It was coming from the hallway outside my door. I lay there, frozen, straining to hear, telling myself it was just the pipes settling or some trick of the wind. Eventually, the sound stopped and I drifted back to sleep. Over the next few nights, the noises got louder and closer. I started hearing footsteps in the hallway when no one else was supposed to be around, whispers I couldn't quite make out, and doors creaking open and shut. I told myself I was just stressed, but it started to feel more like someone, or something, was following me. The weirdest part was that the noises never happened during the day. They only came at night, when the apartment was completely silent and still. One night, around 2 a.m., I woke up to a tapping on my bedroom window. I live on the second floor, so it didn't make sense for anyone to be there. I froze, staring at the dark glass, and then, slowly, I saw it. A pale face pressed against the outside of the window. It was hard to see clearly, but the eyes were dark, deep hollows that seemed to pierce through the glass. I blinked, and it was gone. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, and by morning I was questioning my sanity. I decided to investigate the building. I wanted to see if anyone else had experienced anything strange. The next day, I met a neighbor, an older man named Harold who had lived there for over 20 years. I asked him casually if anything weird ever happened, expecting a laugh or a shake of the head. He stared at me for a long moment and then whispered, "You shouldn't be hearing things. You shouldn't be seeing things. But if you do, don't answer. Just don't answer." I laughed nervously, thinking he was joking, but the seriousness in his eyes made me pause. I tried to press him for details, but he shut down completely, mumbling something about, "They don't like it when people talk." I left, feeling more unsettled than before. That night, I had a dream, or maybe it was a vision. I was walking down the hallway outside my apartment, but the walls were rotting and covered in black streaks. Shadows moved along the walls, and I could hear whispers repeating my name. When I reached the end of the hall, I saw a figure standing there, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed bent in all the wrong directions. Its face was a blank mask, smooth and featureless, and it tilted its head slowly as if studying me. I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. After that night, I started noticing more disturbing things during the day. Objects in my apartment would move slightly, like they had been nudged. My keys disappeared and reappeared in strange places. Sometimes I would feel cold air brush past me even when the windows were closed. I tried to tell myself it was paranoia, but the incidents kept escalating. One evening, I came home to find the hallway outside my apartment lined with handprints, smudged into the walls in black, sticky-looking substance. There was no one there, and the prints seemed to vanish when I tried to touch them. I stopped leaving my apartment after dark. Work was stressful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me in the hallways. Something patient, biding its time. I installed a few cameras around my place just to feel safer, but reviewing the footage only made things worse. One night, the hallway camera showed a dark shape standing at the far end of the hall for hours, motionless, staring directly at my door. The next night, another camera caught the same shape, closer to my apartment. And then one night, I watched in horror as it moved directly past the door, and the frame went black for a moment before cutting back to static. I tried to leave, but the next morning, my car wouldn't start. It was as if the battery was drained, even though I had charged it the night before. I called a tow truck, but when the driver arrived, he refused to come near the building, muttering about things that live in the shadows and don't let them out. I had no choice but to stay inside. feeling trapped. The presence grew bolder. One night, I was lying in bed when I felt a hand on my shoulder. I jumped up, but no one was there. The handprint remained, icy cold, pressed into my skin. The whispers started to form words, taunting me, calling me names I didn't recognize. I tried recording them, but the microphone picked up only static and a low, distorted hum. I started researching the history of the building. It had been constructed in the 1920s, and there were rumors of a fire that had killed several people in one of the upper floor apartments. The records were scarce, but I found old newspaper clippings mentioning unexplained deaths and disappearances in the area, dating back decades. One article, yellowed and torn, described tenants hearing footsteps, seeing figures in the halls, and being driven to madness by something that waits in the dark. One evening, I decided I had had enough. I packed a bag and drove out, vowing to never return. But as I got into my car, I noticed something terrifying. The building's lights were all on, even though I had left the main switch off, and every window on the second floor, the floor I lived on, was glowing with an unnatural pale light. And then I saw them. Faces pressed against every window, staring at me. Hollow eyes, twisted mouths, all of them watching. I slammed the door and drove away, not looking back. I thought I had escaped, but the feeling of being watched never left. Over the next few weeks, I noticed shadows in my own home, fleeting shapes in the corner of my eye. I would wake up to doors slightly ajar, objects moved, whispers in the silence. I had brought the darkness with me, carried it like a parasite that only needed me to survive. Then came the phone calls. At first, they were silent, just a line open with static. But soon, I could hear breathing, slow and deliberate, coming from the other end. Occasionally, a voice would whisper, "I see you," or repeat my name over and over. I changed numbers, but the calls kept coming. One night, I was too tired to answer, and I left my phone on the counter. I woke up to the ringing, and when I picked it up, the line was silent, except for a voice that came from the receiver, whispering so close I could feel it against my ear. "You can't hide. We are here." I moved again, this time across the country, hoping distance would help. But it didn't. A few months later, I woke in the middle of the night to find my bedroom door open. The air was thick and cold, and standing there in the doorway was the figure from my dream months ago, the impossibly tall one with twisted limbs and the featureless face. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I felt its gaze like a physical weight pressing down on me. The next morning, I checked my camera footage. It showed nothing unusual, just the empty room. But when I turned to my closet, I found dozens of handprints smeared across the walls inside, black and sticky, pressed into the plaster as if someone or something had been leaning there, waiting. I started noticing patterns. Every time I tried to ignore it, it became more aggressive. Objects would fly across the room, shadows would stretch across walls in impossible angles, whispers turned into guttural growls that shook the windows and doors. I realized in a sickening moment that it wasn't bound by the walls of any one building. It followed, patient and relentless, until there was nowhere left to run. I sought help from experts, people who claimed to study the paranormal. They couldn't explain much, only that the entity seemed to be drawn to fear itself. It didn't care where I went, only that I felt alone, vulnerable, terrified. Every night became a battle to stay sane, every shadow a potential threat, every creak of the floor a warning. Months passed, and I stopped sleeping entirely. My body was failing, but I couldn't rest, not even for a moment, because the moment I closed my eyes, I saw it. Always watching, always waiting. The whispers became a chorus, chanting my name, promising that it would not stop, ever. And then one night, I saw it in the mirror. Not a reflection, but standing behind me, taller than the ceiling, limbs bent and twisted like branches in a storm. Its face was featureless, but I felt the intensity of its attention, a suffocating presence that pressed into my skull and my chest. I couldn't move, I couldn't scream. I could only watch as it reached for me, long fingers stretching impossibly far, and I knew with certainty that this was no longer something I could run from. I tried everything, salt, talismans, prayers, everything I thought might keep it at bay. But nothing worked. It was patient, unending, existing beyond the limits of time and space, a shadow in the corners of my life that refused to release me. Friends and family noticed my absence, but I couldn't explain what was happening without sounding insane. Even if I could, I doubted anyone would believe me. Now, as I sit here writing this, the air is thick and cold, and I can feel it behind me, just beyond the edge of vision. I know I can't escape it. It's patient. It's inevitable. And I also know that one day it will make contact completely, and there will be nothing left of me to witness it. All I can do is write this, a warning, a record, hoping that maybe someone will understand, maybe someone will know to listen when the shadows start whispering. Because if you ever feel that cold brush against your skin in the dead of night or hear the faint scratching outside your door, don't ignore it. Don't try to rationalize it. Don't answer when it calls your name. Whatever it is, it's not just in the building. It's patient and it's waiting. And the worst part? It never stops. Story the end. It had been a week since the move, and already the house felt wrong. Not in the creaky old floorboards kind of way, which was normal for a 1920s build, but something heavier, like a low pressure in the air that made your skin crawl. My name is Mark, and I'd just taken a job as a night shift security guard at a storage facility on the outskirts of Cincinnati. The house I rented was cheap, bordering on suspiciously cheap for its size, and I had ignored the small warnings, the neighbors avoiding eye contact, the lawn left untended for years, and the smell of damp wood that never fully went away. I thought I was imagining it at first, chalking it up to anxiety over moving and starting a new job, but I wasn't imagining it. The first night was subtle. I had unpacked the bare minimum and was trying to get to sleep early. The bedroom was at the back of the house, and I remember lying in the dark, the daft counting the old pipe's soft groans until I noticed a different sound, a faint scraping like nails or claws against the floor above me. I live alone. There is no upstairs. At first I convinced myself it was rats, the wind rattling the old roof, anything but the reality forming in the back of my mind. I sat up, flashlight in hand, and scanned the ceiling. Nothing. But then the sound came again, slightly louder this time, deliberate almost, moving from one corner of the ceiling to the other. It was enough to make the hairs on my neck spike straight up. I pulled the covers over my head, trying to rationalize it, but sleep was impossible. The next day, I brought a ladder from the garage and examined the attic access. Locked, nailed shut, and dusty. No one had been up there in decades, if ever. I shrugged it off and told myself I was being paranoid. The sound didn't return during the day, and I went to work, feeling the slight relief that light always brought. That night, however, it escalated. The scraping was accompanied by breathing, slow, heavy breaths like someone leaning over me while I slept. I couldn't bring myself to turn on the light. I lay frozen for hours, counting the breaths, timing the intervals, trying to convince myself it was a trick of my imagination. By 3 a.m., the sounds had stopped, replaced by silence so deep it was almost louder than the noise. I fell asleep at dawn, exhausted, but the unease stayed. At work, the storage facility was quiet but functional. I had a small office, a bank of monitors, and an alarm system. Nothing out of the ordinary until the third night. I was sitting in the chair, reviewing security footage, when I noticed a movement in camera 3, an old storage unit at the very back of the lot. The door was supposed to be locked, and there was no record of a tenant renting it. The camera feed flickered, then stabilized. On the screen, the unit door was slightly ajar, moving as if someone had nudged it, though no one was there. I radioed the control room for confirmation, no one else on site. I walked out to the lot, flashlight in hand, heart hammering. The door swung slightly with each gust of wind, though the night was still. I leaned in to close it, and then I saw the writing, scrawled in what looked like dirt and oil across the metal, the words, "Get out!" I ran back to my office, slamming the door and locking it. That night, sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined shadows moving across my ceiling, scraping and breathing like before. The following week was worse. I began noticing things in the house, small things at first, doors slightly open that I had closed, items moved, lights flickering. Always subtle, enough to make me question my own memory. My reflection in the mirror would sometimes linger a second too long before moving, and I started seeing shadows just out of the corner of my eye. I started sleeping in the living room with a baseball bat beside me, lights on, TV playing static white noise. One night around 2 a.m. I heard whispering. Not faint, but clear, urgent. I froze, straining to hear. The words were incoherent, jumbled, like a language I almost recognized but couldn't place. I remember the hair on my arms standing straight up, every nerve screaming at me to run. I grabbed my bat and moved toward the sound. It seemed to be coming from the kitchen, but when I turned the corner, the room was empty. The whispering stopped immediately, replaced by silence. After that, I started documenting everything, thinking maybe writing it down would help me process what was happening. I bought cameras, installed motion detectors, everything I could think of. It didn't help. The recordings were often blank or static or worse, images I didn't understand. One night, I reviewed footage from the living room camera and saw myself asleep on the couch, eyes closed, when a dark figure slowly appeared behind me. It leaned in, breathing over my head. I froze in terror, unable to move, watching myself flinch in my sleep. Then it was gone. The footage ended with me waking suddenly, but in reality, I had never fallen asleep. I stopped leaving the house except for work. Friends stopped calling after I declined invitations, citing exhaustion. I didn't care anymore. The house became my cage. I began hearing things on my walks to the bus stop. A voice calling my name from alleys, the crunch of footsteps behind me, never visible, never caught on camera. Then came the night of the shadows. I was awake, sitting in the dark when the lights started flickering violently. Shadows leapt along the walls, desks twisting into shapes I didn't want to recognize. Humans, or things that resembled humans, crawling, stretching, merging with each other. They moved with a grotesque fluidity, like they were made of smoke and broken glass. I screamed, bat in hand, and the shadows scattered. My heart was racing, lungs burning, but I noticed the temperature had dropped. Frost was forming along the windowsills. I knew I had to get out. I grabbed my coat, keys, and wallet and ran to my car, swerving down the street. It followed me. Not in a car, not visibly, but I could feel it. On the highway, a presence hovered, making the air thick, pressing against me through the metal of my car. At a rest stop, I saw it, or what I think I saw. A figure crouched behind the gas pumps, impossibly thin, face blank and white, eyes hollow voids. It raised a hand and I felt nausea, dread, the urge to drive faster than humanly possible. I did. I didn't stop for hours, finally reaching a motel where I slept in my clothes, lights on, door chained. I called my old landlord the next day and asked if anyone had died in the house. He paused, hesitant, then said quietly, "A family. The Martins. About 20 years ago, fire in the kitchen, only the youngest boy survived." I found old newspaper articles online confirming it. The details were horrifying. Smoke inhalation, charred bodies, the boy found wandering the street, screaming about shadows in the walls. I felt a chill run down my spine. It explained everything, or at least part of it. The scraping, the whispers, the shadows. But it didn't explain why it was now focused on me. I tried leaving town, but every motel, every hotel, every safe place I found felt wrong. The presence followed me, always just at the edge of my vision. Sometimes in mirrors, sometimes in reflections of store windows, sometimes in the rearview mirror of my car. I began keeping a journal obsessively, cataloging everything. I stopped eating properly, stopped sleeping properly, existing only in the dim light of rented rooms or fast food parking lots. One night, I woke up to a voice whispering directly in my ear, "You belong here now." I bolted upright. The room was dark, but the air was thick, cold, and wet. I could hear footsteps circling the bed, slow, deliberate, patient. My phone was dead. My car keys were gone. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadows gathered at the corners of the room, stretching toward me. I felt fingers, cold and wet, grazing my skin, creeping beneath my clothes. I clawed at the bed, trying to escape, but I couldn't. I realized then that leaving was impossible. The next morning, I woke up in the same house. My car was in the driveway, keys on the counter, phone charged and lying beside my bed. Everything appeared normal, too normal. My journal was gone, the cameras erased, the house was quiet. Too quiet. I thought I was hallucinating, imagining the previous night, but the smell of smoke lingered in the air. And on the wall, written in charred black streaks near the ceiling, were the words, "Welcome home." I stayed. I had no choice. The job, the apartment, everything was tied to that cursed plot of land. At work, the shadows found ways to invade, always in the periphery of monitors, static glitches revealing fleeting images of impossible forms. One night, I saw the storage unit's door creak open by itself again. This time, I didn't run. I walked up to it, heart hammering, and inside, the shadows waited. They formed a shape, the boy from the fire, or what remained of him, smiling in a way that was not human. "It's your turn," it whispered, and I understood. The house, the shadows, the presence, they feed, and now I was part of the meal. I tried to leave, tried to resist, but the boundaries of reality bent around me. Every street, every hotel, every open space folded back into the house. The walls breathed, the floors groaned, the whispers never stopped. Every night the shadows came closer, watching, waiting, learning my fears. I realized then that it wasn't just the house, it was everything. The fire never truly ended. The shadows never truly went away. They merely waited, patient, until someone new arrived. And I had arrived. I tried to warn people once. A friend from work called when I didn't show up. I invited him over, hoping to show him the truth. He never returned. Later, the landlord told me he hadn't seen him in days. No one believed me. And why would they? The house looks normal from the street. The neighborhood looks normal. I look normal. But inside, I am trapped in an eternal night. The whispers never stop. The shadows never stop. Every time I blink, I see them, at the corner of my eyes, in reflections, crawling beneath walls, curling around door frames, whispering secrets I do not understand but feel deep in my bones. I've learned to live in their presence, to navigate the impossible spaces they create, to survive in a house that is alive and hungry. Sometimes I sit in the living room, staring at the walls, listening to the scraping in the ceiling, waiting for the night when they finally decide to claim me entirely. I know that day will come, and when it does, I will join the boy, the shadows, the fire, in an existence that is neither life nor death. Until then, I am prisoner, guardian, and prey, existing in the thin line between our world and the darkness that dwells just beyond. I never leave. I never can. And I know if you ever see a house on the outskirts of Cincinnati, cheap and inviting, with the lights flickering strangely at night, you should not enter. Because once you cross the threshold, once the shadows see you, it is too late. You belong to the house. I belong to the house. Story the end. It was just after midnight when Mark Sullivan's truck rumbled down the desolate stretch of highway that cut through the Appalachian foothills in Western Virginia. He had left his cousin's house in Roanoke a few hours earlier, the evening spent drinking and reminiscing about their childhood, and now he was alone on the road, the tires humming against the slick asphalt as rain began to fall. The streetlights were few and far between, flickering weakly like dying stars, casting long, wavering shadows across the forest that pressed up close to the highway. Mark liked to drive at night, the solitude and quiet helping him think, but tonight something felt different. He couldn't put his finger on it, but the air seemed heavier, the darkness more oppressive. He glanced at the rearview mirror. Nothing. Just the dim glow of his taillights disappearing into the wet road behind him. He shook his head, blaming fatigue and a few too many beers for his nerves. He'd driven this highway dozens of times. He knew every curve, every rise, every dip. Yet as he rounded a bend, a flicker of movement at the edge of the tree line made him jerk the wheel instinctively. A figure was standing there, just beyond the shoulder, perfectly still. Mark's stomach dropped. He squinted through the rain-streaked windshield. It was a man, or it looked like one at first, wearing a dark hoodie, hands at his sides. But the posture was wrong, stiff, unnatural. The figure didn't step forward or wave. It just stood, head tilted slightly as if studying him. A chill ran down Mark's spine. He muttered a curse under his breath and floored the accelerator, trying to convince himself it was someone hitchhiking or maybe just a trick of his tired eyes. A few miles passed, and he told himself he was being paranoid. The figure was gone, but the feeling didn't leave. A gnawing sensation, low and insistent, like eyes were on him from all sides. Mark's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. He could hear the rain tapping lightly on the roof, but beneath it, faintly, there was another sound. Tap, 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 like fingernails drumming on the metal bed of his truck. He slammed on the brakes, heart hammering. The tapping stopped, leaving only the dull roar of tires on wet asphalt. He shook his head violently, trying to clear it. Fatigue, he told himself again. Fatigue and too much beer. An hour later, the road narrowed as it wound through a stretch of dense forest. The trees pressed in close, limbs scraping against one another in the wind, creating strange, whispering sounds. Mark hated this stretch of road at night. Even in daylight, it felt claustrophobic. Now, under the cloak of darkness and rain, it was suffocating. And then he saw it. A shadow moving against the tree line, darting from one side of the road to the other. Mark's hands gripped the wheel as the shadow crossed in front of him. His heart raced. He braked hard, the tires skidding slightly on the wet surface. When he looked in the rearview mirror, the shadow was closer. It didn't move normally. It seemed to float, elongated, with limbs bending at impossible angles. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, but it didn't disappear. Panic clawed at him. He gunned the engine and tried to put distance between himself and whatever it was. But the road seemed to stretch endlessly, curving in impossible ways. Trees that should have been 30 feet apart seemed to close in, and every turn brought more shadows at the edge of his vision, some flickering, some stationary. He kept repeating to himself, "It's just exhaustion. It's just my imagination." Around 2 a.m, he passed an old, run-down motel tucked against the forest. Its neon sign flickered weakly, the parking lot empty. Something about it called to him, a strange pull he couldn't explain. On impulse, he pulled in, hoping for a break from the oppressive road. As he parked, he noticed another figure standing under one of the flickering lights. Pale, impossibly thin, with a featureless face. Mark's stomach turned. It didn't move in any conventional way. It tilted its head, and he felt a pressure in the air, like the figure was aware of him in a deeply personal, invasive way. He locked the doors and gunned the engine, leaving the parking lot in a screech of tires. The highway returned to the familiar stretch of forest, but the terror did not abate. Shadows twisted at the edges of the road. Shapes moved in impossible ways. And then the tapping began again, louder, insistent, echoing in the cab beneath his feet. He looked down, looked around, but there was nothing. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had no meaning. Mark rounded a bend and saw it again, standing in the middle of the lane. It wasn't human, not truly. Its limbs were too long, bending at unnatural angles, its head featureless and pale. Its presence alone pressed against him, squeezing the breath from his lungs. Mark swerved violently to avoid it. The tires left the asphalt and skidded onto the shoulder, sliding down into mud. He climbed out, soaked, shaking, heart hammering. The figure stood a few yards away, unmoving, as if it had been waiting. Mark stumbled backward, mind racing, adrenaline surging. The tapping continued, now louder inside his skull. He ran back to the truck, tried to start it, but the engine wouldn't turn over. The figure tilted its head slowly, and Mark felt a wave of cold press into his chest, deep and inescapable. He ran into the forest, stumbling through wet leaves and mud, branches tearing at his clothes and skin. The shadows followed, curling around him, impossible to escape. He could hear whispers now, faint at first, then forming words. "You cannot leave. You belong." Days passed, or maybe hours. Hunger and exhaustion clawed at him, but fear was stronger. He found an abandoned farmhouse eventually, broken windows, a door hanging on rusted hinges. Inside, the figure waited, motionless, pale, faceless. Mark tried to speak, but his voice failed. The figure raised one impossibly long hand and pointed at him. Cold seeped into his bones, a sensation that made him collapse, shivering violently. Time became meaningless. Mark wandered the endless corridors of the forest and roads, the figure always nearby, patient, unyielding. The tapping never ceased, resonant in his chest, in his skull, echoing in the empty spaces of his mind. Shadows twisted into impossible shapes. Hallways of the farmhouse stretched infinitely. The figure moved with him, always observing, always waiting. Eventually, search parties found the wrecked truck at the edge of the forest, but Mark was never recovered. Locals whispered about the haunted highway, about travelers vanishing, about the pale, faceless figures seen at the edge of the road. They warned those who drove that stretch at night, "If you hear tapping, do not stop, do not look back." Some who encounter it return hollow, some never return at all. Years passed. The highway remained. The figures remained, the tapping continued. Travelers report shadows at the edge of vision, whispering voices on the wind, glimpses of something impossibly thin and faceless, moving with unnatural speed. The figure is patient, relentless, unbound by distance or logic. No one knows what it wants or why it chooses its victims. Some believe it feeds on fear. Some say it is a remnant of something ancient, older than the mountains themselves. But those who encounter it know one thing: once the tapping starts, there is no escape. It waits always, patient and hungry, stalking you until you are taken. Even now, along that stretch of highway in Western Virginia, travelers report the sound, a faint tap, tap, tap beneath their feet, echoing inside their skulls, growing louder in their minds. And if they glance in the mirror, sometimes, just for a second, they see it. Pale, thin, faceless, and impossibly still, waiting patiently for the night to end, knowing the road will never truly let them go. Story the end. It was a chilly November evening when Eric Thompson decided to take the long route back home from his shift at the plant. The factory, in the outskirts of Dayton, Ohio, had let him leave a few hours earlier than usual, and the roads were mostly empty, the only illumination coming from the flickering streetlights that dotted the highway. He was tired, mentally and physically drained from the repetitive work and long hours, and the silence of the road offered an odd comfort. He liked these drives when he could think without interruption, when the monotony of the road matched the monotony of life. But tonight, something felt different, though he couldn't place it. The air in his old pickup was heavy, damp, with the first hints of frost forming on the edges of the windshield. He wiped it clear and glanced at the rearview mirror. Nothing, just the familiar stretch of asphalt disappearing behind him. He took a deep breath and tried to focus on the road, the hum of the engine grounding him. It started subtly, the first sign that something wasn't right. At the edge of the tree line lining the highway, he thought he saw movement, a shadow that shouldn't have been there, flitting between the trees. He shook his head and muttered under his breath, fatigue, overwork, simple mistakes of perception. He pressed on, trying to convince himself of normalcy. About 20 miles down the road, he saw the figure. A man, or at least he looked human, standing perfectly still at the shoulder. Eric instinctively slowed. The man wore a dark hoodie, his face obscured by shadows, standing in the rain that had begun to fall lightly. Eric rolled down the window, voice tight with caution. "Do you need a ride?" The figure tilted its head slowly, unnaturally, and the world seemed to drop a degree colder. Then a voice, soft and almost mechanical, whispered through the rain, "Don't look back." Eric's chest tightened. His fingers gripped the steering wheel harder, and without responding, he accelerated, forcing the truck forward. When he glanced in the rearview mirror, the figure was gone. But the unease remained, knotting in his stomach like a living thing. The road grew narrower, twisting through dense forest that loomed close enough for the branches to scratch the sides of the truck. The rain grew heavier, hammering against the windshield, obscuring vision. And then it happened. Something darted across the road, impossibly fast. Eric slammed on the brakes, tires squealing. When he looked up, there was nothing there. And then, in the mirror, a shadow. Not a shadow of the trees, but a shape that seemed impossibly thin, stretching in ways that defied his understanding. Its limbs were long, moving too fluidly, bending at impossible angles. Fear, raw and unrelenting, washed over him. He pressed the accelerator, tires spinning slightly on the slick road. The forest seemed to close in, and each turn revealed another impossibility. A curve that should have ended in a small clearing extended endlessly, the trees pressing closer, almost leaning in to block his passage. The tapping began then, faint at first, echoing through the cab of the truck, beneath his feet in his skull. Tap, 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 deliberate, insistent, mocking. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed in this nightmare loop. The road twisted in ways that made no sense. Familiar landmarks vanished, replaced by dense forest and fog that clung to the ground like a living thing. Eric's eyes were strained, scanning every shadow, every movement, and always the tapping, never ceasing, a rhythmic promise of something coming, patient and inevitable. Eventually, he reached a clearing where a dilapidated gas station flickered weakly. He pulled in, relief flooding him, hands trembling violently. The attendant, a teenage boy with hollow eyes, didn't acknowledge him except to swipe a card through the register. Eric couldn't speak, his mouth dry, and all he wanted was to get back on the road, to leave this nightmare behind. The moment he left the station, he saw it again. Standing in the middle of the lane ahead, impossibly tall and thin, featureless, pale. Limbs bent in unnatural ways, swaying slowly. His stomach lurched. He swerved, tires leaving the road, sliding into the shoulder, the mud sucking at the tires. Eric tried to climb out, but the figure remained. He tried to start the truck, but the engine refused. The tapping grew louder, now inside his skull, resonating in his chest, echoing in the empty spaces of his mind. He backed away, stumbling into the forest, branches tearing at him, but the tapping followed, patient and deliberate. And then he heard it, a whisper, carried by the wind. You cannot leave. Time became meaningless. Hunger gnawed at him, thirst clawed at his throat, yet fear propelled him forward. Shadows moved around him, impossible shapes, bending the forest itself. He stumbled upon an abandoned farmhouse eventually, windows broken, doors hanging on rusted hinges. Inside, the figure waited, pale, faceless, limbs bent unnaturally. One impossibly long hand pointed at him. A coldness seeped into his bones, deep and pervasive, pressing, crushing. Days, weeks, or perhaps months passed. Eric wandered, trapped in the looping nightmare of forest and road. Sleep offered no reprieve. The tapping echoed in his dreams. Hallways of the farmhouse stretched endlessly, doors leading to impossible corridors. The figure moved with him, patient, silent, unrelenting. Eventually, authorities found the truck abandoned on the side of the highway, but Eric was gone. Locals whispered about the haunted stretch of road, about travelers vanishing, about pale, faceless figures seen at the edge of the highway. They warned, if you hear tapping while driving at night, do not stop. Do not look back. Some who encounter it return hollow, some never return at all. Years passed. The road remained, the figures remained, and the tapping never stopped. Travelers report shadows at the edge of vision, whispers on the wind, glimpses of something pale, thin, and impossibly still. The figure is patient, relentless, unbound by distance or logic. No one knows what it wants or why it chooses its victims. Some say it feeds on fear. Some say it is older than the mountains themselves. But those who encounter it know one thing. Once the tapping starts, there is no escape. It waits, always, patient and hungry, stalking you until you are taken. Even now, along that stretch of highway in Western Virginia, travelers report the faint tap, tap, tap beneath their feet, echoing inside their skulls, growing louder in their minds. And sometimes, just for a moment, they see it, pale, thin, faceless, impossibly still, waiting patiently for the night to end, knowing the road will never truly let them go. Story the end. It started in late October when the air grew crisp and the nights came earlier than most people expected. I had recently moved into a small, old house on the outskirts of a town in Ohio. It wasn't anything fancy. 2 stories, peeling paint on the exterior, and a backyard that sloped sharply into an overgrown wooded area. I had gotten it for a steal because the previous owners were eager to leave. I didn't ask too many questions at the time. I was young, a few years out of college, and desperate for independence. The first few nights were quiet, almost too quiet. The house had creaks, as old houses do, and I'd often chalk them up to the natural settling of the structure. The windows rattled with the wind, the pipes groaned when water ran through them, and the old wooden floorboards sometimes let out low, mournful creaks when I walked from room to room. But around the 3rd night, I started hearing something else. It was subtle at first, a soft scraping sound from the hallway outside my bedroom door, like fingernails against wood, or maybe the dragging of something heavy. I told myself it was a branch scraping against the siding, or maybe a raccoon or opossum in the attic. Rationalizations kept me calm. But the sounds didn't stay outside. They moved. One night, I woke up to the distinct sound of footsteps pacing above me. I lived on the 1st floor. The steps were heavy, deliberate, pacing from one end of the house to the other. I froze, my heart hammering. I told myself the previous tenants probably left the house in a rush, that there was nothing here but me. Eventually, the noise stopped, and I fell back asleep with every light on in the house. The following day, I searched the house meticulously. The attic was empty except for dusty boxes, the basement held only old furniture and cobwebs, and the main floor showed no sign of entry. I started locking doors and windows, but the unease remained. That's when the first visual anomaly happened. I was in the kitchen around 10 p.m., making coffee to calm my nerves, when I saw it, a dark figure standing in the living room, just at the edge of the light from the overhead lamp. I froze, my hands trembling, staring at it. Then it blinked, or maybe just vanished. I ran to the hallway, calling out, but the house was silent. No one was there. I told myself I was imagining things, the mind playing tricks when you're sleep-deprived and anxious. But deep down, I knew it wasn't imagination. Over the next week, the events escalated. Objects moved on their own. My keys, which I always left on the counter, would end up on the stairs. Books that I had placed neatly on shelves were found in piles on the floor. And every night, the footsteps returned, louder now, sometimes accompanied by whispers that sounded like someone speaking just beyond the edge of comprehension. I began recording audio on my phone when I slept. At first, nothing. Then, one night, I woke up to a cold draft and a low, guttural whisper saying, "Don't leave." I played back the recording the next morning and froze. The voice was unmistakable, a deep, hollow tone that seemed to seep into the room. I tried to reach out to the neighbors. There was an elderly woman across the street named Mrs. Halloway. She had lived in that neighborhood for over 50 years. When I asked her about the house, she hesitated. "You don't want to be here after dark," she said quietly. "The last family, they didn't last a month. You should leave while you can." I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off. "I think you're joking," I said. She shook her head, looking genuinely frightened. I pressed her for details. She told me that the house had been empty for decades before I moved in, and that every tenant since the late 70s either left abruptly or disappeared. She didn't say the last word, but I could read it in her eyes. They hadn't left voluntarily. That night, I couldn't sleep. The whispers were back, louder this time, coming from the hallway near the stairs. I grabbed a flashlight and followed the sound. As I turned the corner, I saw a shadow move across the wall. Tall, almost human, but wrong. It glided, not walked, and it seemed to pulse with a dark presence. I stumbled backward, tripping over the carpet, and it was gone. That was when I noticed something chilling. Scratches on the wall, deep, as though someone or something had clawed at the plaster. The marks were fresh. I started keeping a journal, documenting everything that happened. I rationalized that if I wrote it down, I could make sense of it. The scratching sounds became nightly occurrences, always in the bedroom and always following the same pattern. Something would stand at the foot of my bed, invisible in the darkness, and scratch against the wall or floor. Sometimes I thought I felt its breath on my neck. I began sleeping with a kitchen knife under my pillow. Then came the incidents with the mirrors. One night, I woke up to a movement in the bathroom mirror. At first, I thought it was my reflection, but it wasn't. Something was behind me. I spun around. Nothing. When I turned back, the mirror reflected something else entirely. A tall figure, hunched and featureless, standing in the corner of the bathroom, staring at me. Its limbs were elongated, and it seemed to ripple like dark water. I yelped and ran to the kitchen, turning on every light. The figure didn't appear again, but the fear lingered. The house began to feel alive. Doors that I had locked would be found ajar. Footsteps would echo through the rooms, sometimes running up the stairs, sometimes pacing back and forth. One night, I came home to find all the lights on in the house, though I was certain I had turned everything off. The worst was the basement. I had been avoiding it, but one night, curiosity, or perhaps desperation, forced me to go down. The air was cold, damp, and heavy. At the far end, I noticed a faint red glow. I followed it, and there, carved into the wall, were words, "You are next." The scratches were deep, fresh, and smelled faintly metallic, like blood. After that, I called a local paranormal investigator. He came the next day, an older man named Carl, who had dealt with haunted houses in the region for decades. He walked through the house, listened, felt, and measured. His instruments picked up anomalies, sudden temperature drops, electromagnetic fluctuations, and audio distortions that matched the whispers I had been hearing. He didn't outright say it, but he told me one thing. Whatever was in that house had been there a long time, feeding on fear, and it did not want to leave. I tried to leave. I packed a bag, loaded my car, and drove away. But when I returned a few days later to grab a few things I had forgotten, I found the house exactly as I had left it. No signs of intrusion. But the shadows, those dark, amorphous shapes, were in every window, staring at me as I approached. I felt a pull, almost like the house itself was breathing, drawing me closer. That night, I didn't sleep in a motel. I stayed in my car, doors locked, windows up, and flashlight trained on the house. I saw movement in the second floor window. Something was looking at me. Sleep deprivation started to take its toll. The shadows became more aggressive, sometimes reaching into rooms where I was standing. I would catch glimpses in peripheral vision, only for them to vanish when I looked directly. I began to hallucinate, or maybe the house was manipulating my mind. Whispers turned into coherent phrases, telling me things I didn't want to hear. Secrets about my family, threats, promises of pain. I stopped talking to anyone outside of the house. I didn't want them involved. One night I heard crying from the attic. Not the wind, not an animal, human crying. High-pitched, desperate. I climbed the stairs, flashlight shaking in my hands, and pushed open the attic door. The space was empty except for dust and boxes, but the crying continued, echoing from nowhere and everywhere at once. Then the attic light flickered on, an old, bare bulb that I had never touched. The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a voice that whispered directly into my ear, "Come down." I ran from the attic and didn't stop until I was in the basement. The lights there flickered on as well. The message was carved into the wall again. "Come down." I felt an irresistible pull as if gravity had doubled. I tried to resist, but my legs moved on their own. The basement door slammed shut behind me. I screamed. The shadows condensed in the corners, forming a mass that seemed to breathe. It stretched, elongated, and the whispers grew into screams that rattled my skull. Something cold brushed against my skin, like ice and oil combined. I blacked out. I woke up on the floor of the basement hours later, or maybe days. Time had no meaning. The shadows were gone, but the words remained, carved deep into the plaster. I stumbled upstairs, my body shaking uncontrollably. Every mirror I passed reflected not me, but a figure standing behind me, silent, watching. I fled the house, leaving everything behind. I never returned. I moved across the state, changed my phone number, even altered my social media presence. But the house stayed in my dreams. Every night, I would see it, standing in the fog at the end of a road, lights flickering, windows watching. Sometimes I would wake to find my own reflection distorted in the mirror, shadowed and elongated, whispering the words I had tried to forget. Years passed, and I tried to rebuild my life, but fear became a constant companion. I would wake in the middle of the night to the sound of scraping, the faint smell of decay, the cold brush of unseen fingers. Friends began to notice my paranoia, my jumpiness, my tendency to check locks obsessively. They assumed it was stress or maybe trauma from a previous life event. But the truth was worse. Whatever had claimed that house, whatever had hungered on fear and isolation, had left a part of itself in me. I was never safe. Not fully. And sometimes late at night, when the wind was right, I would hear the faint echo of footsteps pacing a hallway and a voice whispering, soft but clear, "You belong here." I know I will never truly escape it. The house exists in my mind as much as it exists in the world, a shadow that follows, patient and eternal. I can feel it, watching, waiting, reminding me that I am never alone, that my fear is fuel, and that the hunger never ends. And so I live with it, constantly. Every creak of the floor, every scratch at the walls, every flicker of light becomes a reminder of that house, and the thing that lives there waiting for the next soul foolish enough to step inside. I have learned to accept it. I have learned that resistance only angers it. I have learned that sleep is a battlefield. Mirrors are lieutenants of horror, and shadows are not cast, they are alive. The last time I checked online, the house was still listed, though the description was sanitized. Charming historic home in quiet neighborhood. Needs some renovation. No mention of the past tenants, no warning of the whispers, no clue of the shadows that watch from the corners. And I know someone will buy it. Someone will move in, alone, thinking they can handle it. And when they hear the scratching at night, the whispers, the footsteps pacing endlessly, it will begin again. Because it never ends. It cannot end. It waits. It hungers. And I know that one day it will come for me fully. And when it does, the nightmares I have survived will be nothing compared to what is waiting. Story the end. It was just past midnight when David Miller decided to take the long drive from his small apartment in Cincinnati back to his parents' farm in rural Kentucky. He had spent the evening at a friend's party, the kind where the music never stopped and the air smelled of cigarette smoke and spilled beer. Now, alone in his aging sedan, the rhythmic hum of tires against the wet asphalt offered a comforting monotony. The highway stretched out before him, a black ribbon cutting through endless forest and hills. He liked driving at night. It allowed him to think, to forget the pressures of work, and to feel, for a moment, untethered from the world. But tonight, something felt off. The first sign was subtle, a flicker at the edge of his vision. A shadow, too tall, too thin, darting among the trees lining the highway. He blinked, adjusted the rearview mirror, tried to convince himself it was a trick of the low light or fatigue from the long day. But the feeling of being watched, of eyes pressed against him, did not dissipate. His heart began to pound as he gripped the steering wheel tighter. About 40 minutes into the drive, David saw it clearly, a man standing perfectly still on the shoulder of the road. At first, he thought it was a hitchhiker, someone stranded and waiting for help. But as his headlights fell upon the figure, he realized it was wrong. Its posture was stiff, almost unnatural, and the rain dripping from its dark hoodie did not wet its clothes. The hood obscured its face, but he could feel it, its awareness, focused on him, a cold, invasive attention. David slowed. "Hey, do you need a ride?" His voice trembled more than he realized. The figure tilted its head unnaturally. Then, in a whisper carried by the wind, words that seemed to crawl into his mind, "Don't look back." A chill ran down his spine. He pressed the accelerator, forcing the car forward, refusing to glance back. But the sensation of being followed didn't leave. Every shadow along the road seemed to stretch and twist toward him. The tapping began then, faint and irregular at first, a rhythmic sound echoing somewhere beneath the car, in the pedals, under the seats. He stopped, looked around, and there was nothing. Just the sound of rain, tires, and the persistent tapping, as if the car itself had taken a sinister life. The highway narrowed, winding through dense forest. Trees leaned close, their skeletal branches scraping against the edges of the road, creating strange, whispering sounds. David's knuckles whitened on the wheel. The tapping continued, growing louder, resonant, like footsteps pacing beneath the floorboards. He tried to tell himself it was his imagination, but the instinctive terror gnawing at him told a different story. Hours or maybe minutes' time had no meaning, passed in that twisting corridor of asphalt and trees. Shadows moved at the edges of his vision, shapes bending impossibly, stretching unnaturally, and then suddenly a flash, a figure darted across the road. David slammed on the brakes, tires squealing, heart hammering. In the rearview mirror, another shape appeared, tall, thin, featureless, limbs bending in ways that defied logic. Panic clawed at him. He gunned the engine, tires spinning slightly on the slick asphalt. The road seemed to stretch endlessly, curves extending farther than they should, dips appearing where the ground should have been flat. The forest pressed closer, thickening, suffocating, like it had a will of its own. The tapping intensified, now inside his skull, reverberating through his chest, echoing in the empty spaces of his mind. Eventually, he spotted a flickering light, the faint glow of an old gas station. Relief surged through him. He pulled in, soaked from the rain, hands trembling violently. The attendant barely looked at him, his expression blank, eyes glazed. David tried to speak, to explain the fear that clutched at him, but the words caught in his throat. He bought a bottle of water and fled back to the car, desperate to escape the oppressive air. Once back on the highway, the figure appeared again, standing in the middle of the lane, impossibly tall and thin, limbs bent at wrong angles, face a smooth, featureless expanse. His stomach turned. He swerved violently to avoid it, the tires leaving the asphalt and sliding into mud. The car rocked dangerously, engine groaning, but the figure did not move, did not need to. Its presence alone pressed against him, crushing, invasive. David climbed out, soaked, shivering violently. The rain poured over him, but it did nothing to wash away the cold pressing against his chest. The figure remained, silent, patient, watching. The tapping continued, louder now inside his skull, in his chest, in his bones. A whisper echoed, carried by the wind, "You cannot leave." He ran into the forest, branches tearing at his clothes and skin. The shadows followed, curling around him, bending the very air, impossible shapes twisting in the dark. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, thirst clawed at his throat, yet fear drove him forward. He stumbled upon a decrepit farmhouse eventually, windows broken, doors hanging on rusted hinges. Inside, the figure waited, pale, faceless, limbs bent unnaturally. One impossibly long hand pointed at him. Cold seeped into his bones, deep, pervasive, unrelenting. Days, weeks, perhaps months passed. Time had no meaning. David wandered endlessly, trapped in the looping nightmare of road, forest, and farmhouse. Sleep offered no reprieve, the tapping echoed in his dreams. Hallways stretched infinitely, doors led to impossible corridors. The figure moved with him, always present, patient, silent, relentless. Eventually, authorities found the abandoned car near the edge of the forest, but David was gone. Locals whispered about the haunted stretch of highway, about travelers vanishing, pale, faceless figures seen at the edge of the road. They warned, if you hear tapping while driving at night, do not stop. Do not look back. Some who encounter it return hollow, some never return at all. Years passed. The highway remained. The figures remained. The tapping never ceased. Travelers report shadows at the edge of their vision, whispers on the wind, glimpses of something impossibly thin and faceless, moving with unnatural speed. It is patient, relentless, unbound by logic or distance. No one knows what it wants or why it chooses its victims. Some say it feeds on fear. Some say it is older than the mountains themselves. But those who encounter it know one thing. Once the tapping starts, there is no escape. It waits, always, patient and hungry, stalking you until you are taken. Even now, along that stretch of highway in western Kentucky, travelers report the faint tap, tap, tap beneath their feet, echoing in their skulls, growing louder, louder, until they cannot ignore it. And sometimes, just for a moment, they see it. Pale, thin, faceless, impossibly still, waiting patiently for the night to end, knowing the road will never truly let them go. Story the end. It was one of those nights where the wind howled like a living thing through the skeletal trees that lined the narrow country road. I was driving home from a late shift at the diner in the outskirts of Ashford, Pennsylvania. The place was small, with barely enough neon light to make the open sign flicker convincingly, and my shifts had gotten later and later ever since the diner hired a new manager who demanded more from the night crew. The rain was steady, slapping against my windshield in a rhythm that made the hum of the engine sound almost comforting, like white noise masking something more sinister in the dark beyond the glass. I'd been working nights for nearly 2 years, and in that time, I had learned the subtle signs that told you a place was normal or deeply wrong. But I was tired, bleary-eyed, and my mind had been wandering all the way home, thinking about the sandwich I had left in the diner's freezer. I didn't want to go home empty-handed, so I figured I'd stop by the back door, grab it quickly, and be done. The diner's back exit led to a narrow service road that ran behind the building and emptied onto a stretch of unlit highway. Nobody ever came back there at night except the delivery trucks, and even they were rare after 11 p.m. As I pulled into the small parking lot behind the diner, I noticed that the fluorescent light above the door was flickering violently. It created this strobe effect that made everything look like a poorly edited horror movie. My heart picked up its own tempo, a nervous thump that wasn't entirely rational, but I chalked it up to exhaustion. I parked, grabbed my keys, and stepped into the drizzle. The cold rain hit my face sharply, and I shivered under my thin jacket. The air smelled damp and metallic, like wet soil and rusted machinery, and for some reason that smell set me on edge. I unlocked the back door and pushed it open, expecting the usual dim, fluorescent glow inside. But the kitchen was dark, completely dark. My first thought was that the power had gone out, which wasn't uncommon during storms, but then I noticed a faint movement near the prep table. I froze. At first I thought it was a trick of the flickering light outside, shadows dancing through the window, but the figure moved again, slowly, deliberately. I swallowed hard and called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" My voice sounded unnaturally loud, echoing in the empty kitchen. The movement stopped. The silence that followed was worse than anything I had ever heard. It was the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums, making your own heartbeat feel invasive. I turned on my phone's flashlight and shone it toward the prep table. There was no one there. Nothing. Just a knife rack and a half-opened container of lettuce. My pulse was racing. I told myself I was imagining things. I was alone. Nobody would be here this late. But as I bent down to grab my sandwich, I heard it. A whisper, faint but unmistakable, right behind me. I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but again, nothing. The whisper had been so soft, almost like it was part of the wind. I tried to shake it off and decided to just grab the sandwich and leave. That's when I felt it, a cold hand brushing against my shoulder. It wasn't the kind of cold you get from a chilly room or rain. It was bone deep, sinking into your flesh like frostbite. I screamed, spinning around, but the kitchen was empty. I ran, heart hammering, toward the back door, yanking it open and spilling out into the rain. I didn't stop until I was back in my car, locking the doors and fumbling for the keys. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the service road, my eyes darting to the mirrors, expecting to see something chasing me. But there was nothing, only the rain and the night. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination. Stress, lack of sleep, the storm, rational explanations. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in that kitchen with me, something that shouldn't have existed in the physical world. When I finally got home, I locked every door and window and collapsed on the couch, trying to calm down with a cigarette and a glass of whiskey. That night, I barely slept. Every creak in the house sounded like footsteps. Every shadow in the corner of the room seemed to stretch toward me. The next morning, I tried to laugh it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. I called my coworker, Janice, who was working the early shift. I asked if she had noticed anything strange the night before. She laughed. "You mean the power flicker?" "Yeah, it was weird, but nothing else." I didn't tell her about the whisper or the hand on my shoulder. She would have thought I was losing it. The next week, the feeling followed me everywhere. At work, I couldn't focus. I kept looking over my shoulder, imagining figures in the corners of the dining area, the shadows that weren't there. At home, I kept the lights on, but the darkness seemed heavier, almost viscous, pressing against the walls and furniture. I told myself it was paranoia, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. It all escalated the following Friday. I had just finished closing the diner, and it was past midnight. The storm had intensified, rain pelting the roof like small hammers. I drove home along the same back road, headlights cutting through the sheets of water. I was nearly home when my headlights caught movement in the distance, something standing on the side of the road. I slowed down, squinting through the rain. It was a man, or at least it looked like a man, but he wasn't moving like a person. His limbs were too stiff, his head cocked at an impossible angle. I blinked, thinking I was hallucinating from exhaustion, but when I looked again, he was closer, standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, tires screeching on the wet asphalt. My car fishtailed, nearly hitting the ditch. When I regained control, he was gone. Just the empty road and the storm. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the headlights, a reflection, maybe someone walking on the edge of the road. But the fear settled deep in my chest, and for the first time, I felt a primal urge to get home. Not just for comfort, but to survive. I reached my house, a modest two-story on a quiet street, and locked the doors. I checked every window, every door. I even looked in the attic, which I never go up to. Nothing. But the unease lingered. That night, I woke up to the sound of scratching at the front door. Slow, deliberate, like someone dragging their fingernails across the wood. My heart almost stopped. I told myself it was the wind, but the sound didn't move with the gusts. It stayed, growing louder, closer, until I could hear it through the locks. I didn't sleep again. The following week, I started noticing things around my house that weren't right. Small objects would be moved. Doors that I swore I had locked would be open. Shadows would flicker in the corner of my eyes, vanishing when I turned to look. I tried to rationalize everything, but deep down I knew something had attached itself to me, something that wasn't human. It followed me from the diner. It had been waiting in the storm, feeding off my fear. Then came the night I realized I couldn't escape it. I was asleep, or at least I thought I was, when I woke to the sensation of someone sitting on my chest. I couldn't move. My limbs were paralyzed, my throat frozen. In the dim light filtering through the curtains, I saw it, a shadowy figure, taller than a man, with limbs that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. Its face was featureless, just a smooth black void, but I felt its gaze. I couldn't scream. I couldn't even breathe properly. Time stretched, seconds becoming hours, until I thought I would die right there. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. My body collapsed, shaking as if I had run a marathon. I was drenched in sweat, and the room smelled of wet earth and rust, the same smell from the diner. I couldn't stop thinking about that kitchen, about the hand on my shoulder, about the whisper. Over the next few weeks, things escalated. I started hearing voices calling my name, whispers that seemed to come from inside the walls. Mirrors would fog up with messages I didn't write. cryptic phrases that vanished when I tried to read them properly. I knew I couldn't stay in the house, but every time I tried to leave, the figure appeared in my peripheral vision, sometimes in the rearview mirror of my car, sometimes standing across the street, watching. It followed me, patient, unyielding, a constant presence that I could neither fight nor ignore. One night, desperate, I drove back to the diner. I needed answers. The storm was returning, and the roads were slick and treacherous. I parked behind the building, flashlight in hand, ready to confront whatever had started this nightmare. The back door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the smell hit me immediately. Wet soil, rust, decay. And there, in the dim light of the flickering kitchen, was the figure, motionless, watching. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. I raised the flashlight, and the beam hit it directly. The air grew colder, the shadows around it stretching unnaturally, writhing. Then it spoke. Not in words, but in a thought, a direct message to my mind. You cannot leave. I dropped the flashlight. It clattered to the floor, rolling toward the figure. The room seemed to stretch, ceilings elongating, shadows thickening. My knees buckled. I scrambled backward, tripping over a mop bucket, my hands scraping against the wet tile. When I looked up, it was gone. The kitchen was empty, but the smell lingered, thick and metallic, clawing at my lungs. I ran all the way to my car and didn't stop until I was back on the highway. I drove for hours, not caring where I was going, just trying to put as much distance as possible between me and that diner. When I finally stopped at a gas station on the edge of a small town, I thought I was safe. I called my friend Mark, explaining everything between sobs and gasps for air. He listened quietly, then said, "Maybe it's better if you just leave the state for a while. Sleep in a motel somewhere nobody knows you. Don't go back to Ashford." I didn't argue. I drove north, aiming for Vermont, thinking the rural roads and small towns might offer some kind of respite. But the feeling followed me, always at the edge of vision, just outside the circle of my headlights. The whispers came at night when the motel walls were thin, echoing from the vents, the ceiling, the floors. I tried to stay awake, tried to distract myself with TV and phone games, but exhaustion always won, and every time I slept, it came back. Weeks passed. I avoided Ashford entirely. I moved from town to town, always on the road, never staying more than a few nights in one place. But no matter where I went, the presence was there. It didn't speak, it didn't attack, it just watched. It had claimed me. I realized slowly that it wasn't bound to the diner or the storm or even the roads I drove. It had attached itself to me. It was patient, immortal, unyielding, and no amount of distance could break its hold. One morning, after months on the road, I woke to the sensation of cold on my face. I opened my eyes to find it standing in the motel doorway, silhouetted against the rising sun. Its limbs were impossibly long, its face featureless, its presence a suffocating weight. I tried to move, tried to scream, but nothing happened. I knew, in that moment, that this wasn't going to end. There was no fight, no escape. The figure would follow me until the day I died. And even then, I wasn't sure it would let go. I left the motel that day and kept driving. I haven't stopped. I haven't called anyone except for this one friend, Mark, who warned me to keep moving, to never go back, to never try to confront it. I don't know what it is or why it chose me. All I know is that it is real, and it is patient, and it will find me no matter where I hide. I've stopped looking at my rearview mirror. I've stopped turning off the lights at night. I've stopped hoping for normalcy. There's only the road, the rain, the darkness, and the presence that follows silently waiting. Every diner I pass, I feel its eyes on me. Every shadow makes me jump. Every whisper in the wind carries its message. And I know that one day, I'll wake up, and it will be closer than it ever was before. Because it is patient, and it is inevitable. Story the end. It began on a cold, rainy night in early November, the kind of night when the streets of a small Midwestern town glisten with wet asphalt and the air smells faintly of smoke from distant chimneys. I had recently moved to a rural area in Pennsylvania, about 30 minutes from the nearest town, into a house that was old but cheap. An old farmhouse with creaking floors, sagging porches, and windows that rattled in the wind. I thought it would be quiet, peaceful. I thought I would finally escape the chaos of city life. I was wrong. The first night, the house was silent, save for the rain and the occasional groan of its old wooden beams. I unpacked my things, arranged the furniture, and settled in, telling myself that any noises I might hear would just be the house settling. But around midnight, I woke to a faint knocking, a rhythmic thump coming from somewhere deep in the house. It wasn't at the door. It wasn't at the windows. It sounded like it was coming from the walls themselves. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, straining to hear, but it stopped as suddenly as it had started. I told myself it was nothing, perhaps the pipes or a branch hitting the side of the house. I went back to sleep, though my dreams were restless, filled with shadowed shapes and muffled whispers. The second night was worse. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, pacing across the upstairs floorboards. My bedroom was on the first floor. Whoever or whatever was walking above me had a heavy, almost deliberate gait. I froze, listening, telling myself I had imagined it. But then came the whisper, so faint I could barely hear it. Go back to sleep. It was guttural, low, and yet familiar in a way I couldn't place. I lay there, paralyzed, until the footsteps receded into silence. Sleep didn't come again that night. Over the next few days, strange things began happening. Objects moved on their own. My keys, which I always left on the counter, would vanish and turn up in places I hadn't touched. The bathroom sink, the top of the refrigerator, inside the oven. Books I had stacked neatly were scattered across the floor. The feeling of being watched became oppressive. Even during the day, I couldn't shake it. Shadows seemed to linger just out of the corner of my eye, moving when I turned my head. I started locking doors, shutting windows, leaving lights on, but it didn't help. The sense of presence persisted. I attempted to rationalize it. I was isolated, stressed from moving, tired. Surely it was my mind playing tricks. But the unease escalated. One night, around midnight, I woke to the sound of breathing in my room. It wasn't mine. It was slow, deliberate, and it came from the corner near the closet. I turned on the light. Nothing. The closet doors were closed, but the air was icy, my skin prickling with a chill that no blanket could dispel. That night I slept with a baseball bat by the bed. A week later, I heard the first voice. I was in the kitchen, making coffee, when I thought I heard someone whisper my name. I froze. "Hello?" I called out. The kitchen was empty. The voice came again, closer, almost at my ear. "You shouldn't be here." I spun around, but no one was there. The refrigerator hummed normally. The windows were shut tight, the rain still drumming outside. I could feel it then. The house itself watching me, aware of me in a way that went beyond normal human perception. The nights became unbearable. I began recording audio with my phone when I slept. The first few nights, nothing seemed unusual. Then one night, I woke to a wet, dragging sound across the floor, like someone moving heavy furniture. My flashlight swept the room. Nothing. I played back the audio in the morning. A low, guttural moan filled the recording, followed by whispers, unintelligible but undeniably human. I showed it to a friend who worked in audio engineering. He said it was real, no edits or anomalies that could explain it naturally. Desperate for help, I reached out to the previous owner. He was reluctant to speak. You should leave," he stammered. "I didn't last more than 2 months in that house. Something's in there. It's not human." I pressed him for details. He spoke in hushed tones, glancing over his shoulder, as though the house itself could hear him. He told me the place had a long history of strange occurrences, disappearances, deaths, people leaving abruptly, and that the locals avoided it. I felt a chill so deep it settled in my bones. The visual manifestations began next. It started with shadows, small and fleeting, just at the edge of my vision. Then I saw a figure in the hallway mirror, tall, faceless, hunched, and dark as a void. It disappeared when I turned my head, leaving only the reflection of an empty hallway. Objects began flying off shelves, doors slammed on their own, and sometimes I heard the faint cries of a child, echoing through the house, though the property had never belonged to anyone with children in decades. Sleep deprivation became a constant companion. I would wake in the middle of the night to the sensation of something standing over me. The weight of the presence was suffocating, cold, and heavy. One night I woke to a hand on my shoulder, a hand that felt ice-cold, stiff, and impossibly heavy. I bolted upright, bat in hand. The bed was empty. My heart raced for hours, sleep impossible. I began seeing writing on the walls, deep scratches in the plaster that hadn't been there before. Words scrawled in uneven, desperate letters, "You can't leave." I tried painting over them, cleaning them, even scrubbing them with bleach. They returned within hours. I started documenting everything, taking pictures, audio recordings, even video. The manifestations continued to escalate. Sometimes I would hear a voice behind me repeating what I had just said in a distorted, mocking tone. Sometimes my own reflection would move independently of me, gesturing, mimicking, watching. I called a local paranormal investigator, a man named David, who had dealt with haunted sites for decades. He arrived with equipment, EMF detectors, infrared cameras, thermal scanners. The readings were off the charts. Cold spots, electromagnetic spikes, unexplainable audio anomalies. He warned me that whatever was in the house had been feeding on fear for decades, maybe longer, and that it wasn't just a spirit, it was something else entirely. Something that existed between dimensions, patient, intelligent, and malicious. I tried leaving. Packed a bag, got in my car, drove an hour away, only to receive a text from an unknown number. Come back. My phone had no service in the area I had driven to. No one could reach me. Yet the message appeared exactly at the time I thought of leaving. I turned the car around, desperate, terrified. When I returned to the house, the lights inside were on, despite me leaving them off. Shadows moved behind the windows, watching. I began hearing conversations, whispers that carried long histories of the house, tales of families that vanished, of pain and suffering, all spoken in voices that were distorted but unmistakably human. I would hear my own name repeated in the darkness, sometimes followed by threats, sometimes by promises of something I couldn't comprehend. One night, I saw faces pressed against the windows, pale, distorted, staring, mouthing words I couldn't understand. Isolation became unbearable. I stopped answering calls, stopped visiting friends, stopped going to town. The house became my entire world, a prison, a predator, and a master. The shadows began to follow me during the day. Even when I went outside, I could feel their gaze, as if the property itself had expanded beyond its physical boundaries. The feeling of being watched never left. The manifestations escalated further. Doors would open on their own, lights would flicker, objects would hurl themselves across rooms. Sometimes I would see the tall, black, faceless figure standing at the top of the stairs, waiting, silent. Other times I would catch glimpses of smaller, twisted shapes darting across the periphery, disappearing before I could focus on them. I slept less and less, sometimes only an hour or two a night, waking drenched in sweat and frozen in terror. Then came the nights of voices. I would hear my own thoughts spoken back to me in distorted, mocking tones. I would wake to find writing on the walls that mirrored my deepest fears, my insecurities, my regrets. One night, the writing formed a single phrase that made my blood run cold. You are mine. I could feel it in the air, a presence pressing down on me, heavy, suffocating. I tried to leave again, packed the car, loaded all I could carry, drove 50 miles before stopping at a gas station. I tried to call a friend, tried to explain, but my phone died suddenly, despite being fully charged minutes before. The car would not start. I was trapped. I looked up to see shadows stretching across the lot, darkening the area as if the night itself had thickened. I could hear whispers all around, though no one was there. Panicked, I ran on foot, leaving the car, leaving everything. I made it to a friend's house in the nearest town. I stayed there for days, telling my story. My friend tried to rationalize it, telling me stress, sleep deprivation, maybe even hallucinations. But the scratches on my arms, the bruises in the shape of fingers, the lingering cold that seemed to follow me even indoors, told a different story. The fear had followed me. The house had extended itself into my life, through shadows, through whispers, through the persistent weight of its presence. Months have passed. I've moved again, further away, trying to escape the reach of that place. But the shadows follow. They lurk at the edge of my vision, flit across walls and empty rooms, haunt mirrors, whisper my name when I'm alone. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I see the shape of the faceless figure standing outside, watching from a distance, waiting. I cannot sleep fully. I cannot escape. I am always aware, always on edge, always fearing that one day it will come for me fully. I have learned to live with it. I have learned that resistance invites it, that anger feeds it. Sleep is a battlefield. Mirrors are lieutenants of horror. Shadows are alive, patient, and intelligent. They remember. They wait. They will claim whoever dares to enter that house next, and eventually they will claim me fully. Every so often, I see a listing online. Charming historic farmhouse needs some renovation. The description is sanitized, the warning's erased, someone will move in, someone will think it's just an old house. But the house waits. It hungers. And I know deep down it has not forgotten me. Story the end. The night had fallen hard over the outskirts of rural Pennsylvania. I was driving alone, the long stretch of Route 322 cutting through the dense forest like a ribbon of black asphalt. The rain had been relentless all evening, drumming against my windshield in a chaotic rhythm that made the wipers struggle to keep up. My truck's headlights barely pierced through the downpour, leaving me to navigate mostly by memory and the faint glimmer of distant, obscured signs. I'd been on the road for hours, returning from a late-night work assignment in Harrisburg, and the emptiness of the highway was beginning to weigh on me. There were no other cars in sight, no lights from homes or farms, just the wet, shadowed forest pressing in on both sides of the road. I remember thinking how silent everything was under the roar of the rain, almost too silent. I felt a shiver as I pressed the accelerator slightly, trying to keep the truck warm and my mind awake. That's when I first saw it, a figure standing at the side of the road, drenched and barely visible under the blur of rain. My first instinct was to swerve, but something about the way it stood, unnaturally still and straight, forced me to slow down. It was a man, or at least it looked like one at first. His clothes were soaked and dark, clinging to his body. He didn't move, didn't wave, didn't acknowledge me at all. Just stood there, facing the forest rather than the road, as if he had been waiting for something. I kept my eyes on him as I passed, the fog of rain blurring his outline. I remember thinking, maybe he's just waiting for a ride, but then a horrible thought struck me. The forest around him seemed wrong. Too quiet, too still. No movement of animals, no ripple of leaves in the wind. I shook my head and tried to ignore it, telling myself I was tired and imagining things. About 10 miles down the road, I noticed my gas light flicker on. Great, I thought, of course. I needed fuel, and the only station I could see was a small, decrepit convenience store that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Its flickering neon sign read "Open," though the bulbs were half out, giving the word an eerie, broken glow. I parked under a puddle-strewn lot, the rain soaking through my jacket as I stepped out. The air smelled of wet asphalt and something metallic, faint but unmistakable. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed with a low hum, casting the cramped shelves in a sickly green tint. The store was empty, except for the man behind the counter. He looked ordinary at first glance, middle-aged with a scruffy beard and a worn baseball cap, but there was something off. His eyes, they were too pale, almost gray, and they didn't seem to register my presence at all. He continued to methodically sort candy bars, ignoring the chime of the door. I walked up to the counter, clearing my throat. "Hey, pump two?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He looked up briefly, and I saw his expression freeze in a way that made my stomach twist. His eyes met mine for just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Something in that glance made me feel like I'd been caught doing something unspeakable. The look was hollow, yet piercing, as if he knew everything about me and didn't care. He nodded once, slowly, without speaking, and I took that as a confirmation. I went back to my truck, the rain still relentless. As I started the engine and pulled away, I noticed the man was standing outside now, watching me from the edge of the parking lot. My skin crawled. For some reason, I couldn't take my eyes off him. His stance hadn't changed. He wasn't running or waving, just standing, watching. And then I saw it. Faint. Almost imperceptible at first, but unmistakable. He was moving. Backwards. Slowly, carefully, as if he had no feet, just sliding across the ground. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. I glanced away, forcing myself to focus on the road, and when I looked back in my rearview mirror, he was gone. Shaking, I tried to laugh it off. Maybe I was exhausted, overworked, imagining things. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't really disappeared. I filled my tank at a gas station further down the road, an actual one, with lights, people, and signs of life. I tried to dismiss the first encounter as a hallucination, a combination of fatigue and the storm. But the unease stuck with me. A few hours later, as I drove past the small town of Bellefonte, I noticed the same figure again, standing at the edge of the forest, in the same posture, rain pouring down over him. My stomach dropped. How could it be him again? I hadn't turned back, hadn't doubled back. There was no way he could have walked that fast. And yet, there he was, just beyond the foggy glow of my headlights. I tried to keep driving, keeping my eyes forward, but the forest seemed to close in. The rain made shadows that looked like hands reaching out, like the trees themselves were moving toward the road. I thought about calling 911, but my phone had no signal. I had passed through these stretches of highway many times before, but never like this. Never with a presence following me that wasn't human, or at least not completely human. By the time I reached the next exit, I saw him again, now on the side of the road, and I couldn't take it anymore. I swerved, nearly losing control on the wet asphalt, and slammed my brakes. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I wanted to scream, but the rain drowned out any sound. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Around the man's feet, the ground was different. The asphalt beneath him was cracked, soaked with black water that seemed to ripple unnaturally. Every step he took left a mark that wasn't normal, like the road itself was bleeding. And the deeper I looked, the more I realized he wasn't walking. He was sliding on that black liquid, gliding toward me, silently, effortlessly. I floored the accelerator and took the next exit at high speed, weaving through the deserted streets of the town. The rain kept hammering down, thunder rolling over the hills. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away from him. I thought about stopping at a motel, anywhere with people, lights, cameras, witnesses. The first motel I saw had an out-of-service sign hanging crookedly over the door. The second one, same thing. Even the roadside diner, open all night according to its flickering neon sign, had its windows blacked out and a lock on the door. It was like the town itself had disappeared, leaving only me and the storm. Finally, I found a small motel at the end of a side street, barely lit, with a single car parked outside. I parked in front, heart racing, and ran inside, dripping wet. The lobby smelled of mildew and old coffee. The clerk was a young woman, maybe in her 20s, and she looked genuinely startled to see me. "Room for the night?" I asked, trying to catch my breath. She nodded, frowning. "Sure, just one," she said, handing me a key. "We've only got the end room." I paid, grabbed my bag, and hurried to the room, slamming the door behind me. The lock rattled as I double-checked it. I leaned against the door, trying to calm down, listening to the storm outside. That's when I heard it, a soft, scratching sound, like nails scraping on the wood of the door. My heart stopped. I pressed my ear against it, but it was coming from outside the door. The sound continued, slow, deliberate, impossible to ignore. I looked out the peephole, but the corridor was empty. The scratching stopped as suddenly as it began, leaving a ringing silence. I backed away from the door, feeling the cold sweat trickle down my back. That night I didn't sleep. Every sound, the rain, the wind, the occasional creak of the building, made me flinch. I kept thinking I saw shadows move past the small gap beneath the door, figures gliding instead of walking, and every time I turned to check, there was nothing. The next morning, I woke up to find the door slightly ajar. I remembered locking it myself. I froze, listening. Nothing. The room was quiet. I grabbed my bag and ran out, deciding never to look back. Driving away from that town, the storm finally eased, but the fear didn't leave me. For weeks, I kept seeing him in the back of my mind, the pale-eyed figure sliding silently on black water, always waiting. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I see him in the corner of my room, just standing there, staring, unblinking, unjudging. Months later, I tried to research the town, looking for anything that might explain it. Bellefonte appeared normal on the map, a quiet historical town, with nothing unusual reported, no missing persons, no disappearances. Nothing that matched the experience I had. I even checked local legends, folklore, old newspaper articles, everything. The only thing I found was a brief mention in a dusty, forgotten archive about a specter of the roads that was said to appear during storms, a figure that traveled faster than a man could walk, sliding over water or mud, appearing near highways late at night. Most of it was dismissed as superstition, but it hit me too closely to ignore. I never saw him again on the road, but I know he exists. That's the part that haunts me the most. I know that if I ever drive alone on an empty stretch of road in the rain, he will find me. And when I think about the way he looked at me, hollow and piercing, I realize it wasn't anger or hate. It was patience. Waiting. waiting for me to slow down, for me to notice him, for me to be alone enough to feel the cold inevitability of what comes next. Sometimes, I wonder if anyone else has seen him, if anyone else has felt the silent, gliding approach of something that isn't quite human. I tell myself I imagined it, that it was stress and exhaustion, that storms make your mind play tricks on you. But deep down, I know the truth. He is real, and he doesn't forget. Even now, when it rains hard at night, I feel a chill, my stomach knots, and my eyes drift to the darkened corner of the room, just in case. Story, the end. It started with the house at the edge of County Road 16. People in town said it had been empty for almost 20 years, its windows clouded with dust and grime, the yard a patch of dead grass and tangled weeds. From the highway, it didn't look like much, just another forgotten place in the middle of nowhere, but there was something about it that made people avoid it. You could ask anyone at Pete's Diner or the gas station down by the intersection, and they'd all tell you the same thing. Don't stop, don't look, don't even drive slow when you pass it. I wasn't from there. I was just passing through, trying to get from Nashville to Denver after my job fell through, and my bank account had dipped dangerously close to zero. My car, a beat-up '09 Civic, had been running hot for a couple of hours, and when I saw the sign for the old road, I figured I'd take the back way to let the engine cool. That was my first mistake. The second mistake was thinking I could spend the night there. I'd pulled over when I saw the house. It sat maybe 50 yards from the road, its sagging porch half hidden by overgrown shrubs. The front door was slightly ajar, the paint on it cracked and peeling. I told myself it was just for a few hours, to get some rest, maybe keep an eye on the car before I tried to push it into the next town. There was no signal on my phone, and I hadn't seen another car for miles. The moment I stepped out, the air felt different. Heavy, thick in a way that pressed on my chest. The field around the house was silent, no wind, no insects, not even the hum of cicadas that had followed me for hours on the highway. I should have left then, but exhaustion and stubbornness are a bad mix. The porch creaked when I stepped on it, and the smell of rot hit me hard, like something wet and moldy that had been sitting too long in the dark. The inside wasn't any better. Dust floated in the air, catching what little light leaked through the cracked windows. The living room was empty except for a couch with its stuffing spilling out and a wooden rocking chair that sat perfectly still, even when I walked past it. I told myself it was fine. I could sleep in the corner, keep my backpack close, and be back on the road by sunrise. But then the sounds started. At first, it was just a faint scratching from upstairs, like mice in the walls. Old house noises, I told myself. I lay down on the floor, closed my eyes, and tried to ignore it. But then the scratching grew louder, more deliberate, like nails dragging slowly across wood. I sat up. My phone said 12:17 a.m., but the battery had dropped from 40% to 18% in less than an hour. I tried turning on the flashlight, but it froze, then shut off completely. The scratching stopped. For a minute, there was nothing but silence, thick enough that I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Then from upstairs, I heard it, footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps, one after another, crossing the length of the upstairs hallway. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, and I strained to listen. There it was again. Step. Pause. Step. Pause. Like someone walking barefoot on old wooden boards. I didn't move. The steps stopped above me, and then there was this. Sound. Not quite a whisper, not quite a breath, but something in between. A soft, drawn-out sigh, like someone exhaling after holding it for too long. I grabbed my backpack, slung it over my shoulder, and moved toward the door as quietly as I could. The boards beneath my feet groaned, and I froze, waiting. That's when something tapped just once on the wall behind me. I didn't look back. I bolted. By the time I reached my car, my hands were shaking so hard I dropped my keys twice before I finally got the door open. I slammed it shut, locked it, and turned the ignition. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. I don't know how long I sat there in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The night outside the windshield was absolute black. No moon, no stars, just dark. Then, from the house I saw it, a faint light flickering in the upstairs window. Not a steady glow, but a dim, sickly light that pulsed like it was alive. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was overtired and seeing things. But then it moved. The light shifted, and for a split second I saw a shape against the glass. A tall, thin silhouette standing perfectly still, its head tilted slightly to one side. I couldn't breathe. The light went out. That was when I heard it again, but closer this time. That soft, dragging sigh, except now it wasn't in the house. It was right outside my car. I locked the doors again, even though they were already locked. My heart hammered so loud I swore whatever was out there could hear it. Something brushed against the back of the car. It wasn't wind. The handle on the driver's side door clicked, like someone testing it, pressing it gently but firmly. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I don't know how I made it through the rest of the night. At some point, exhaustion must have dragged me under, because the next thing I remember was sunlight streaming through the windshield, warm and blinding. I didn't look back at the house when I drove away, but the strangest part? When I finally got into town later that morning and stopped at a small gas station, I asked the guy behind the counter about the house. His face went pale. "You stayed there?" he said, his voice sharp and almost angry. I nodded. "People don't stay in that place," he said. "Not after what happened you're lucky you're sitting here." I asked him what he meant, but he just shook his head and muttered something about the family and the fire. He wouldn't say more, just handed me my change and told me to leave. That night, when I finally got to a cheap motel and turned on the TV, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The local news was running a story about a body found near County Road 16. The details were scarce. They said the victim had been missing for weeks. But the image they showed, a grainy photo of a man with hollow eyes and an awkward, tilted head, made me freeze. It was the same shape I'd seen in the window. I left the motel before sunrise the next morning. For the next week, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following me. No matter where I stopped, gas stations, diners, even crowded parking lots, I'd catch glimpses of movement just beyond my peripheral vision. A shape in a rearview mirror, a shadow slipping behind a building, and at night when everything was quiet, I'd hear it. That same soft, dragging sigh. I got to Denver eventually, but I never really slept again. Not the way I used to. Every time I close my eyes, I feel that weight pressing on my chest, the quiet that hums with something waiting, patient and hungry. And sometimes, like last night, when I'm driving late and the road is empty, my phone will lose signal, the engine will run hot, and I'll swear I see the glow of that house on the horizon, flickering like it's calling me back. Story the end.